The most decorated female sniper in U.S. military history was about to face the fight of her life, and it wasn't on any battlefield. Staff Sergeant Emily Vance had 83 seconds to prove that when they took her rifle they had made the biggest mistake of their careers. 5 men, no weapons, 1 woman who refused to break. Welcome to a story that will challenge everything you think you know about strength, honor, and what happens when the system turns against its own heroes. Stay with me until the end. This gets unbelievable. And comment your city below so I can see how far Emily's story reaches across the world. The Carolina morning hung thick with humidity as Staff Sergeant Emily Vance's boots struck the asphalt in perfect rhythm. Each step echoed with the precision that had made her legendary among the ranks at Fort Bragg, the same precision that had put 347 confirmed kills on her record across 3 deployments. At 28, she carried herself with the quiet confidence of someone who had stared death in the face and never blinked first. "Morning, Sergeant Vance," called out Private Martinez as she passed the motor pool. The respect in his voice was unmistakable, tinged with the kind of awe reserved for living legends. Emily nodded curtly, her steel-gray eyes focused on the administrative building looming ahead. The message had come through official channels at 0600. "Report to Conference Room Delta for mandatory evaluation. Bring full gear." Nothing unusual there. The Army loved its evaluations, especially for someone with her profile. What nagged at her was the addendum scrawled at the bottom in Colonel Morrison's distinctive handwriting. "This assessment will determine your continued fitness for active duty." Fitness for active duty. The words had been gnawing at her since she'd read them 3 hours ago. Emily Vance had never failed an evaluation in her 10-year career. She'd earned the Distinguished Service Cross, 2 Bronze Stars, and a Purple Heart. She held the record for longest confirmed sniper kill in Army history, a 847-yard shot that had saved an entire platoon in Afghanistan. Her fitness for duty had never been questioned. Until now, the building's air conditioning hit her like a wall as she stepped inside, the artificial chill raising goosebumps on her arms despite the long sleeves of her ACUs. Sergeant First Class Rodriguez looked up from the reception desk, his usual smile replaced by something Emily couldn't quite read, pity, maybe, or sympathy. "They're waiting for you in Delta, Sergeant," he said, not quite meeting her eyes. "3rd floor end of the hall." "Thanks, Rodriguez." Emily paused at his desk. "Everything all right?" "You look like someone died." Rodriguez glanced around nervously, then leaned forward and lowered his voice. "Just good luck in there, Sergeant. Whatever this is about, just remember, you've got friends here." The elevator ride to the 3rd floor felt longer than usual, the mechanical hum doing nothing to quiet the unease building in Emily's chest. She'd faced Taliban snipers in the Hindu Kush Mountains, IED sweeps in Kandahar, and firefights that lasted 18 hours straight. But something about this felt different, wrong. The hallway stretched before her, fluorescent lights buzzing overhead like angry wasps. Conference Room Delta sat at the far end, its frosted glass door revealing shadowy figures moving inside. Emily could make out at least 6 shapes more than a typical evaluation board. Her instincts, owned by years of combat, began sending up warning flares. She knocked twice, sharp and authoritative. "Enter!" Colonel Morrison's voice carried the same cold authority that had made him one of the most feared officers at Bragg. Emily pushed open the door and stepped inside, immediately cataloging the room's occupants with the tactical awareness that had kept her alive through 3 combat tours. 5 men stood arranged in a rough semicircle near the far wall, all of them significantly larger than Emily's 5'6" frame. She recognized them immediately. They were members of the base's Special Combat Assessment Team, supposedly the Army's elite hand-to-hand combat specialists. The smallest of them, a compact wrestler named Sergeant Torres, probably outweighed her by 60 pounds. The largest, a mountain of a man called Hayes, who'd played linebacker at Alabama before enlisting, had to be pushing 280. Colonel Morrison sat behind a metal table, his weathered face set in an expression of barely concealed hostility. At 53, Morrison was old-school Army, the kind of officer who'd come up through the ranks when women weren't allowed in combat roles. Emily knew he'd never approved of her assignments, never believed that a woman belonged behind a sniper rifle. "Staff Sergeant Vance," Morrison said without preamble, not bothering to invite her to sit. "I trust you're wondering why you're here." "Yes, sir. The message mentioned a mandatory evaluation." Morrison's thin lips curved into something that might have been a smile on a more pleasant face. "That's correct. Today we're going to evaluate your comprehensive combat readiness." Emily felt the first cold finger of understanding trace down her spine. "Sir, my last combat evaluation was 6 months ago. I scored in the 98th percentile across all metrics. With a rifle sergeant, with your precious rifle." Morrison stood his chair, scraping against the floor. "But what happens when you don't have that rifle? What happens when it's just you, your training, and whatever else you think makes you qualified to serve alongside real soldiers?" The insult hung in the air like smoke from a discharged weapon. Emily felt her jaw tighten, but her voice remained steady. "I believe my service record speaks for itself, sir." "Your service record?" Morrison walked around the table, his movements deliberate and predatory. "Tells me you're very good at pulling triggers from very far away, but up close, hand to hand, when there's nowhere to hide behind a scope." Emily's eyes flicked to the 5 men again. They were watching her with the focused intensity of predators sizing up prey. This wasn't an evaluation, it was a setup. "What exactly are you proposing, Colonel?" "A comprehensive assessment of your close-quarters combat capabilities. These 5 soldiers represent different combat disciplines: wrestling, boxing, mixed martial arts, military combatives, and Navy SEAL training. You'll face each of them in individual combat scenarios." "Armed combat scenarios?" Emily asked, though she already knew the answer. Morrison's fake smile widened. "Unarmed, Sergeant. We've established that you're competent with weapons. Today we test what happens when you don't have that advantage." The trap was now fully visible, its jaws gaping wide. Emily understood exactly what Morrison was doing. He'd arranged for her to face 5 men, each significantly larger and stronger, in hand-to-hand combat, when she inevitably lost, because what 140-pound woman could realistically defeat 5 men trained in combat sports? He'd have grounds to question her fitness for active duty, maybe even recommend her for discharge. "I assume this evaluation is being recorded?" Emily asked. "Naturally, full video documentation. We want everything properly documented for review." Morrison gestured to a camera mounted in the corner, its red light blinking steadily. "Unless, of course, you'd prefer to decline this assessment. Though I should mention that refusal to participate in mandatory evaluations is grounds for immediate review of your security clearance and potential disciplinary action." Checkmate. Emily had to admire the thoroughness of it. Morrison had left her no way out: participate and face almost certain humiliation, or refuse and face immediate consequences to her career. Either way, he got what he wanted: Emily Vance removed from active duty. "I understand the parameters, sir." Emily began removing her gear belt, setting her sidearm knife and equipment pouches on the table with deliberate care. "When do we begin?" Morrison checked his watch. "Immediately. Each engagement will last a maximum of 2 minutes, with 30-second rest periods between opponents. Medical personnel are standing by outside, though I doubt we'll need them for anything more than bruised egos." The 5 men spread out, giving Emily space in the center of the room. She could feel their eyes evaluating her, looking for weaknesses, calculating angles of attack. They saw what everyone saw when they looked at her: a small woman who'd gotten by on luck and long-range weapons. They had no idea what they were actually facing. Emily thought of her father, Master Sergeant William Vance, who'd taught her that size was just an illusion and that leverage could move mountains. She thought of her grandfather, a man who'd survived hand-to-hand combat in 3 wars and had passed down techniques that weren't in any army manual. Most of all, she thought of every person who'd ever told her she didn't belong in uniform, every officer who'd questioned her assignments, every soldier who'd whispered that she was only here because of politics. First opponent, Morrison announced, consulting a clipboard. Sergeant Torres, wrestling background, Olympic trials qualifier. Torres stepped forward, a compact man with the low center of gravity and powerful legs of a lifetime wrestler. At 200 pounds of solid muscle, he outweighed Emily by 60 pounds and had reach advantages that should have made this a foregone conclusion. "Ma'am," Torres said, offering what might have been an apologetic nod. "Nothing personal." "None taken, Sergeant." Emily dropped into a fighting stance that her grandfather would have recognized. Weight, balanced hands positioned for deflection rather than aggression, eyes focused not on Torres's face but on his center mass. "Colonel, are there any rules of engagement I should be aware of?" Morrison's voice carried a note of anticipation. "Military combatives rules apply. No eye gouges, no attacks to the groin, no small joint manipulation. Everything else is fair game. The engagement ends when one participant submits, is incapacitated, or 2 minutes elapse." Emily nodded, never taking her eyes off Torres. She could see him calculating, probably planning to close distance quickly and use his wrestling background to take her to the ground where his size advantage would be overwhelming. It was a smart strategy. It was also exactly what she was counting on. "Begin," Morrison commanded. Torres moved exactly as Emily had predicted, shooting forward in a classic wrestler's takedown attempt. For a split second, it looked like he might succeed. He was fast for a big man, and his technique was flawless. But Emily had been waiting for this exact moment since she'd walked into the room. Instead of trying to sprawl backward or resist the takedown, Emily stepped into Torres's attack, using his momentum against him. Her right hand found the back of his neck while her left gripped his tricep, and she used a technique her grandfather had called borrowing strength, redirecting Torres's force while adding her own precise leverage. Torres hit the ground hard, his 200 pounds of muscle meeting the concrete floor with a sound like a side of beef dropping. Emily maintained her grip on his arm, transitioning smoothly into a position that put dangerous pressure on his shoulder joint. "Submit," she said quietly, applying just enough pressure to make her point without causing permanent damage. Torres tried to muscle out of the hold for exactly 3 seconds before he realized that struggling would only make it worse. "I submit," he gasped. Emily released him immediately and stepped back. The entire engagement had lasted 11 seconds. The room fell silent except for Torres's heavy breathing as he rolled to his knees, rubbing his shoulder. The other 4 men were staring at Emily with expressions ranging from surprise to calculation. They'd just watched their teammate, an elite wrestler, get taken down by someone half his size in less time than it takes to tie a shoe. Morrison looked at his stopwatch as if it might be malfunctioning. 11 seconds, he announced, his voice tight with barely controlled anger. "Next opponent, Sergeant Hayes, boxing and military combatives." Hayes stepped forward, and Emily was reminded of why they called him the Mountain. At 6'4" and 280 pounds, he was more than twice her size, with hands like sledgehammers and a reach that seemed to go on forever. Unlike Torres, Hayes showed no hesitation or courtesy. He'd just watched Emily embarrass his teammate, and his pride was clearly stung. "Let's see how you handle someone who knows how to keep distance." Hayes growled, raising his hands in a textbook boxing stance. Emily reset her position, noting how Hayes kept his weight slightly back, ready to use his jab to control distance. He was smarter than Torres, more patient. He'd try to use his reach advantage to pick her apart from the outside rather than rushing in for a quick finish. "Begin." Hayes immediately began circling, throwing quick jabs to test Emily's reactions. His form was excellent. He'd clearly spent years training in actual boxing gyms, not just army combatives courses. The first jab missed by inches, the second forced Emily to duck, and the third would have caught her square in the face if she hadn't slipped to the side. For 30 seconds, Hayes controlled the engagement, using his reach and footwork to keep Emily at the end of his jab while looking for an opening to land something heavier. To the casual observer, it looked like only a matter of time before his superior size and reach told. Emily let him think that. She circled with him, occasionally darting forward, only to retreat when he threatened with his right hand. She was learning his timing, his rhythm, the little tells that every fighter develops. Hayes favored his left jab but telegraphed his right cross by dropping his shoulder slightly. He liked to circle to his left, away from Emily's power side. Most importantly, he was getting confident, starting to believe that his game plan was working. That's when Emily struck. Hayes threw another jab, this one lazier than the others, and Emily didn't retreat. Instead, she slipped inside his guard, her body moving with the fluid precision of someone who'd trained in arts that most Westerners had never heard of. Her left hand trapped his extended arm while her right delivered a devastating strike to the nerve cluster under his armpit, a technique her grandfather had learned from a Filipino instructor decades ago. Hayes's entire left side went numb instantly. His arm dropped like a dead weight, and before he could process what had happened, Emily's knee found the large muscle of his thigh in exactly the spot that would cause his leg to buckle. The mountain fell hard, his 280 pounds hitting the floor with enough force to rattle the windows. Emily was already moving, securing a blood choke that would render him unconscious in seconds if he didn't submit. "I submit," Hayes gasped, his voice hoarse with shock and pain. Emily released him and stepped back. The engagement had lasted 47 seconds. Morrison stared at his stopwatch again, his face flushing red. 2 of his carefully selected champions had been defeated in under a minute combined. This wasn't going according to plan. "Next opponent," he announced through gritted teeth. "Sergeant Collins, mixed martial arts background." Collins was different from the first 2, leaner at 220 pounds, with the fluid movement of someone equally comfortable striking or grappling. He studied Emily with the calculating gaze of a professional fighter, clearly having learned from his teammates' mistakes. "Impressive," he admitted, rolling his shoulders to loosen up. "But I've trained with some of the best female fighters in the world. Size isn't everything, but technique and conditioning still matter." Emily nodded respectfully. Collins was right. He was the most dangerous opponent, yet someone who understood that speed and technique could overcome size advantages. This wouldn't be about exploiting overconfidence or poor positioning. This would be a test of pure skill. "Begin." Collins came forward methodically, his stance fluid and adaptable. Unlike Torres's aggressive wrestling or Hayes's boxing-heavy approach, Collins moved like water, ready to strike or grapple as opportunities presented themselves. He threw a quick leg kick that Emily checked, followed by a jab-cross combination that forced her to give ground. For the first minute, they traded positions and techniques in what looked more like a chess match than a fight. Collins would throw a combination, Emily would counter and reset. Emily would try to close distance. Collins would stuff her attempt and create space with footwork. It was the highest level of combat anyone in the room had witnessed. But Emily was playing a longer game. Every exchange taught her something about Collins's preferences, his reflexes, his timing. She noted that he favored kicks when backing up, that his takedown defense was stronger on his right side, that he had a tendency to counter with his hands after checking leg kicks. When she finally made her move, it came so fast that the camera almost missed it. Collins threw a kick, Emily checked it and immediately stepped in with what looked like a basic boxing combination. Collins, reading the pattern, started to counter exactly as Emily knew he would. That's when she changed levels, dropping under his counter and driving forward with a technique that combined elements of wrestling, judo, and something much older. Collins found himself airborne, completely inverted, before crashing to the ground in a position that left him vulnerable to a dozen different finishing techniques. Emily chose the simplest one, a chokehold that was both completely legal under military combatives rules and absolutely inescapable once properly applied. Collins struggled for perhaps 10 seconds before tapping out his technical knowledge, telling him exactly how futile resistance would be. "Submission," Emily announced, releasing the hold. The third engagement had lasted 1 minute and 18 seconds. Morrison was no longer consulting his stopwatch. His face had gone from red to purple, and Emily could see a vein pulsing in his temple. 3 of his champions were down, each defeated more decisively than the last. The camera continued recording, documenting what was turning into the most spectacular reversal in Fort Bragg's history. "Sergeant Murphy," Morrison snapped. "You're up." Murphy was the wild card former Navy SEAL, rumored to have more classified kills than Emily herself. At 240 pounds of scarred muscle, he moved with the efficient brutality of someone who'd killed men with his bare hands in places that didn't officially exist on any map. "Ma'am," he said simply, his voice carrying none of the uncertainty that had marked the other fighters. "I've heard stories about your grandfather, William Vance, right served with some interesting people in some interesting places." Emily felt a chill that had nothing to do with the air conditioning. Very few people knew about her grandfather's more specialized training, the techniques he'd learned from instructors whose names never appeared in official records. "You knew him, knew of him, learned some things from people who learned from him." Murphy's stance was unlike the others, looser, more relaxed, but with an underlying tension that spoke of coiled violence. "This should be interesting. Begin." Murphy didn't attack immediately. Instead, he began moving in a pattern that Emily recognized with shock. It was one of her grandfather's warm-up sequences, a flowing series of steps and weight shifts that prepared the body for the kind of combat that wasn't taught in any official military manual. "He taught you the old ways," Murphy observed, beginning to circle. "Question is, how much did he pass down before he died?" Emily felt anger flash through her, but she channeled it into focus. "Enough." They closed simultaneously, moving at a speed that made their previous engagements look sluggish by comparison. Murphy was every bit as good as his reputation suggested. His technique was flawless, his timing perfect, his experience evident in every movement. For 30 seconds, they traded techniques that would have ended any of the previous fights, each countermatched by a counter-counter, each attack neutralized by perfect positioning. Emily realized that Murphy wasn't trying to win quickly. He was testing her, pushing her to reveal the full extent of her training. It was the approach of someone who understood that knowledge was more valuable than victory. That understanding cost him the fight. Emily feinted toward a technique her grandfather had called mountain falling, drawing Murphy into a specific defense. When he committed to the counter, Emily flowed into something else entirely, a combination that her grandfather had learned from a man who'd never officially existed in a war that had never officially happened. Murphy recognized the technique a split second before it landed. His eyes widened slightly, and Emily heard him whisper, "Impossible." The impact sent Murphy sliding across the floor to crash into the far wall. He tried to get up twice before his body reminded him that some kinds of trauma require time to recover from, regardless of training or conditioning. "I submit," he said quietly, his voice carrying newfound respect. Emily helped him to his feet, noting the way he moved his shoulder experimentally. "You okay?" "I'll live. Your grandfather would be proud." Murphy's eyes found Morrison, and something passed between them that Emily couldn't interpret. "One left, Colonel. You sure you want to continue this?" Morrison's face was now a mask of barely controlled rage. 4 of his carefully selected champions had been systematically dismantled by a woman who supposedly owed her career to political correctness and social engineering. Worse, it was all being recorded, creating evidence that would be impossible to suppress or spin. "Final opponent," he announced, his voice tight, Sergeant Williams, powerlifting champion and advanced combatives instructor. Williams was the most physically imposing of the five, shorter than Hayes, but built like a bulldozer with arms like tree trunks and a neck that seemed to connect directly to his shoulders. At 260 pounds of solid muscle, he moved with the mechanical precision of someone who understood leverage and force in the most fundamental ways. Emily studied him as he stepped forward, noting the way he carried his weight, the slight favor he showed his right side, the old scar on his left knee that suggested previous injury. Williams was going to try to end this quickly and decisively, using his overwhelming strength advantage to simply overpower her before technique could come into play. "Nothing personal, Sergeant," Williams said, his voice carrying the gravelly tone of someone who'd spent years shouting over weights and training partners. "But you're about to learn why they don't let women in the infantry." Emily felt the familiar, cold anger settle over her, the same emotion that had steadied her hand through dozens of life-or-death shots. "We'll see about that, Sergeant." "Final engagement," Morrison announced, and Emily could hear the desperation in his voice. "Same rules apply. Begin." Williams came forward like a freight train, and Emily realized immediately that her previous tactics wouldn't work. He was too strong to redirect, too experienced to fall for basic feints, and too committed to his attack to hesitate or second-guess himself. So Emily did something that none of her previous opponents had expected. She attacked first. Instead of waiting for Williams to close distance, Emily exploded forward, using her speed advantage to get inside his reach before he could set himself. Her target wasn't his head or torso, it was his previously injured knee, the weak point she'd identified in her initial assessment. Williams tried to sprawl backward, but Emily was already committed to her attack. Her shin found his knee with surgical precision, striking the exact spots where old scar tissue had never quite healed properly. Williams's leg buckled, sending him crashing toward the floor. Emily followed him down, transitioning smoothly into a submission hold that combined elements of jiu-jitsu, judo, and techniques that predated both by centuries. Williams tried to muscle out of it, his superior strength making Emily's ribs creak under the pressure, but strength without leverage is just wasted energy. Emily adjusted her position slightly, finding the angle that made Williams' power work against him rather than for him. The harder he struggled, the tighter the hold became. "Submit," Emily said quietly. Williams held out for another 10 seconds, his pride warring with the growing pressure on his windpipe. Finally, survival instinct overrode ego. "I submit." Emily released him immediately and stood looking around the room at five defeated opponents and one speechless colonel. The entire engagement had lasted 28 seconds. "Total time," she announced to the camera, checking the digital timer on the wall. 83 seconds. The silence that followed was broken only by the heavy breathing of the defeated soldiers and the soft whir of the recording equipment. Morrison stared at his clipboard as if it might provide some explanation for what had just occurred. Emily began collecting her gear from the table, her movements crisp and professional. "Will there be anything else, Colonel? I have training scheduled at 1400 hours. Morrison's mouth opened and closed several times before any words emerged. "How?" he finally managed. Emily paused in the act of securing her sidearm. "Sir, how is this possible? 5 men, all elite soldiers, all specialists in hand-to-hand combat. You defeated them in 83 seconds. Emily looked around the room at the 5 soldiers, all of whom were now watching her with expressions ranging from respect to awe. Williams was still rubbing his throat. Torres was flexing his shoulder experimentally. Hayes was testing whether feeling had returned to his left arm. "You made an assumption, Colonel," Emily said quietly. "You assumed that because I'm good with a rifle, that's all I know. You assumed that because I'm small, I must be weak. You assumed that because I'm a woman, I don't belong in combat." She finished securing her gear and turned to face Morrison directly. "But most importantly, you assumed that you knew the full extent of my training. You saw what the Army taught me. You never bothered to learn what I knew before I enlisted." Morrison's eyes narrowed. "What's that supposed to mean?" "It means, sir, that some knowledge gets passed down through families. Some techniques aren't in any manual, and some skills are only taught to people who've proven they can be trusted with them." Emily's voice carried a weight that made several of the soldiers straighten unconsciously. "My grandfather didn't just teach me how to shoot, Colonel. He taught me how to survive." She moved toward the door, then paused and looked back. "I believe this evaluation is complete, unless you'd like to test any other aspects of my fitness for duty." Morrison's face had gone pale, his earlier anger replaced by something that looked almost like fear. "Dismissed, Sergeant." Emily opened the door to find a crowd of soldiers gathered in the hallway, their faces pressed against the frosted glass. The word had already spread throughout the base. Staff Sergeant Emily Vance had just done the impossible. As she walked through the crowd, Emily could hear whispers following in her wake. "Did you see that 5 guys in 83 seconds? She made Williams submit. Williams, I've seen him bench press a Humvee. Torres is telling everyone she moved like her grandfather used to. My money says the colonel's going to pretend this evaluation never happened." Emily kept walking, her expression neutral, but inside she felt a grim satisfaction. Morrison had tried to end her career with a rigged evaluation. Instead, he'd given her a platform to demonstrate exactly why she belonged in uniform. But as she pushed through the building's exit doors and felt the Carolina heat wash over her, Emily couldn't shake the feeling that this was just the beginning. Murphy's recognition of her techniques, his knowledge of her grandfather's training, suggested connections that went deeper than simple military tradition. And the way Morrison had looked at her in those final moments, not just angry or embarrassed, but genuinely shaken, suggested that this evaluation had revealed more than just Emily's combat capabilities. Her phone buzzed with a text message. "Unknown number. Impressive performance. Your grandfather would be proud. We need to talk. Tonight. 2200 hours. The old training facility behind Range 19. Come alone. A friend of your family." Emily stared at the message for a long moment, then deleted it. But as she walked across the base toward her barracks, she couldn't stop thinking about Murphy's whispered "impossible" and the growing certainty that 83 seconds had just changed everything. Behind her in Conference Room Delta, Colonel Morrison was making a phone call that would set in motion events none of them could have anticipated. The evaluation was over, but Emily Vance's real test was just beginning. The crowd in the hallway parted like water as Emily made her way toward the exit, their whispered conversations creating a low hum that followed her every step. She could feel dozens of eyes tracking her movement, some filled with admiration, others with disbelief, and a few with something that looked suspiciously like fear. Word traveled fast on a military base, and by the time she reached the main corridor, it seemed like half of Fort Bragg had heard about what happened in Conference Room Delta. "Sergeant Vance." The voice belonged to Captain Rodriguez from the Intelligence Division, a man Emily had worked with during her last deployment. He jogged to catch up with her, his face flushed with excitement. "Is it true? Did you really take down the entire assessment team?" Emily kept walking, her expression neutral. "The evaluation is complete, sir. You'll have to check with Colonel Morrison for the official results." "Official results?" Rodriguez laughed, falling into step beside her. "Emily, there are already 3 different videos circulating on base chat groups. Someone live-streamed the whole thing through the window. You're about to become the most famous soldier at Bragg." That stopped Emily cold. She turned to face Rodriguez, her gray eyes sharp with concern. "What do you mean live-streamed?" Thompson from Communications was walking by when it started. He saw the crowd gathering and started filming through the door, posted it live on the base social network. Rodriguez pulled out his phone, scrolling through messages. "Look at this. Female sniper destroys 5 elite soldiers in 83 seconds. It's already got over 3,000 views, and it only happened 20 minutes ago." Emily felt a chill that had nothing to do with the building's air conditioning. A private evaluation designed to humiliate her had just become a very public spectacle with video evidence that couldn't be suppressed or denied. Morrison's plan had backfired spectacularly, but the consequences were spreading far beyond what either of them had anticipated. "Sir, I need to get back to my duties," Emily said, resuming her walk toward the exit. "Wait." Rodriguez caught her arm gently. "Emily, this is huge. Do you understand what you just did? You didn't just win a fight, you challenged everything they've been saying about women in combat roles. You proved something that's going to echo way beyond Fort Bragg." Emily studied the captain's face, seeing genuine excitement, mixed with something else, hope maybe, or validation. Rodriguez had been one of the officers who'd supported her sniper assignments when others questioned them. He understood better than most what her success meant for military policy and the ongoing debates about women in combat. "I just did my job, sir, completed the evaluation as ordered." "Your job?" Rodriguez shook his head, grinning. "Emily, your job is putting holes in targets from impossible distances. What you just did in there, that was something else entirely. That was a statement." As if summoned by their conversation, Emily's phone began buzzing with notifications. Text messages, missed calls, social media alerts, all flooding in as word of the evaluation spread beyond the base's digital networks. She glanced at the screen and saw names she recognized from her old units, fellow snipers from across the military, even reporters whose numbers she didn't remember giving out. "This is getting out of hand," she muttered, declining another incoming call. Rodriguez checked his own phone, his eyebrows rising. "It's not just getting out of hand, it's gone completely viral. Someone already posted Thompson's video to YouTube. Last I checked, it had 50,000 views and climbing." Emily quickened her pace toward the exit, suddenly feeling trapped by the attention and the implications of what was happening. She'd spent her entire career trying to prove herself through competence and professionalism, not through viral video spectacles. The idea that her most important moment might be reduced to internet entertainment made her stomach turn. But as they reached the building's exit, Emily found her path blocked by Master Sergeant Williams, one of the soldiers she'd just defeated. He stood near the doors, apparently waiting for her, his massive frame still slightly hunched as he favored his injured knee. "Sergeant Vance," Williams said, his gravelly voice carrying none of the hostility it had held in the conference room. "Could I have a word?" Rodriguez took the hint. "I'll catch up with you later, Emily. Congratulations again." As the captain walked away, Williams moved closer, lowering his voice. "First, I want to apologize for what I said in there. That comment about women in the infantry that was out of line." Emily studied the big man's face, noting the genuine contrition in his expression. "Apology accepted, Sergeant. You were following orders." "No, I wasn't. The colonel ordered us to evaluate your hand-to-hand capabilities. He didn't order us to be disrespectful." William shifted his weight, wincing slightly. "I've been in the Army for 15 years, and I've never seen anything like what you did in there. Where did you learn to fight like that? Family tradition?" Emily replied simply. Williams nodded slowly. "Your grandfather, right, I've heard stories. Old-timers talk about him sometimes, usually after a few beers. They say he could do things that weren't in any manual. They say a lot of things." "Yeah, they do. But after what I just experienced, I'm thinking maybe some of those stories weren't as exaggerated as I thought." Williams glanced around, ensuring they weren't being overheard. "Can I give you some advice, Sergeant?" Emily waited. "Be careful. What happened in there, it's going to make waves. Big ones. There are people in this command who aren't going to be happy about how this played out, and they're going to be looking for ways to minimize the damage." "What kind of damage?" Williams' expression grew serious. "The kind that comes when someone proves that everything they've been saying is wrong. You just demonstrated that a 140-pound woman can defeat 5 elite male soldiers in hand-to-hand combat. Do you have any idea how many careers and policies that calls into question? Emily felt the weight of his words settling over her like a heavy blanket. She'd been so focused on simply surviving Morrison's trap that she hadn't fully considered the broader implications of her victory. But Williams was right. Her success didn't just embarrass Morrison or vindicate her own capabilities. It challenged fundamental assumptions about physical requirements, gender roles, and military effectiveness. "I didn't ask for this," Emily said quietly. "No, but you got it anyway. And now you have to decide what to do with it." Williams extended his hand. "For what it's worth, you have my respect and my support if you need it." Emily shook his hand, surprised by the firmness of his grip despite his recent defeat. "Thank you, Sergeant. I appreciate that." As Williams limped away, Emily finally pushed through the exit doors and into the humid Carolina afternoon. The heat hit her like a physical force, but it was nothing compared to the weight of the situation she now found herself in. Her phone continued buzzing with notifications, each one representing another person who'd seen the video, another voice adding to the growing conversation about what had happened in Conference Room Delta. She was halfway across the base when she spotted a familiar figure waiting by her barracks. Lieutenant Colonel Sarah Chen from the Inspector General's office. Chen was known throughout Fort Bragg as someone who took regulation violations seriously and had little patience for administrative games or personal vendettas. "Sergeant Vance," Chen called out as Emily approached. "I need to speak with you." "Yes, ma'am." Chen glanced around at the soldiers who were obviously trying to eavesdrop on their conversation. "In private. Your quarters?" Emily led the way into the barracks and up to her small room on the second floor. The space was spartanly furnished regulation bed desk and footlocker with only a few personal items to distinguish it from any other soldier's quarters. A framed photo of her grandfather in his dress uniform sat on the desk next to her laptop, which was currently displaying dozens of unread email notifications. Chen closed the door behind them and took a seat in the room's single chair. "I suppose you know why I'm here. I assume it has something to do with this morning's evaluation. That's putting it mildly." Chen pulled out a tablet and scrolled through several documents. "I've received formal complaints from 3 different sources about the conduct of that evaluation. I've also been made aware of the video documentation that's currently spreading across social media platforms." Emily felt her stomach tighten. "Ma'am, I participated in the evaluation as ordered. I followed all applicable rules of engagement and maintained professional conduct throughout." "I'm not here because of your conduct, Sergeant. I'm here because of everyone else's." Chen looked up from her tablet. "Tell me, in your professional opinion, was this morning's assessment conducted according to standard evaluation protocols?" Emily considered her answer carefully. "No, ma'am. Standard combat evaluations involve written examinations, practical skills, demonstrations, and scenario-based exercises with proper safety oversight. What occurred this morning was more akin to unsanctioned combat sports competition." "That's a diplomatic way of putting it." Chen made notes on her tablet. "I've reviewed the official justification for the evaluation. Colonel Morrison claimed it was necessary to assess your comprehensive combat readiness in light of your upcoming assignment." "Upcoming assignment?" Chen's eyebrows rose. "You weren't informed. According to the paperwork Morrison filed 2 weeks ago, you're being considered for assignment to a special operations unit that requires enhanced close-quarters combat capabilities. The evaluation was supposedly designed to determine your suitability for that role." Emily felt pieces of a puzzle clicking into place. Morrison hadn't just arranged a humiliating assessment. He'd created an entire administrative justification for it, complete with fictional assignments and bureaucratic cover. The man had planned this operation with the thoroughness of a military campaign. "Ma'am, I haven't been notified of any potential special operations assignments. This is the first I'm hearing of it." "I thought it might be." Chen made more notes, which suggests that Colonel Morrison may have fabricated the entire justification for today's evaluation. That would constitute a serious violation of military protocol and potentially fraudulent use of official resources. The implications were staggering. If Chen could prove that Morrison had manufactured the evaluation's justification, he could face charges ranging from abuse of authority to conduct unbecoming an officer. But Emily also knew that proving such charges would require more than just her testimony. It would require witnesses willing to speak against a senior officer documentation that Morrison might have already destroyed, and an investigation that could take months to complete. "Ma'am, what do you need from me?" "Complete honesty, and I want you to understand that anything you tell me will be part of an official investigation." Chen leaned forward, her expression serious. "Before this morning, had you received any indication that your combat readiness was being questioned or that additional evaluation might be necessary?" Emily thought back over the past few weeks, searching for any signs she might have missed. "No, ma'am. My last fitness evaluation was 6 months ago, and I scored in the 98th percentile across all categories. My last psychological evaluation was clean. My security clearance is current, and I've had no disciplinary actions or negative reports." "What about your relationship with Colonel Morrison? Any previous conflicts or disagreements?" That was a more complicated question. Emily had always sensed Morrison's disapproval of her assignments and achievements, but he'd never been overtly hostile or unprofessional in their limited interactions. The animosity she'd witnessed this morning had seemed to come from deeper sources than simple personality conflicts. "Colonel Morrison has never approved of women in combat roles, ma'am. He's made that clear in various meetings and briefings, but he's never directly challenged my assignments or performance until today." Chen nodded, making notes. "What about the 5 soldiers who participated in the evaluation? Did they seem to be willing participants, or did you get the impression they were following orders?" Emily considered the question carefully. She thought about Torres's apologetic nod, Williams's professional demeanor despite his insulting comment, and Murphy's strange familiarity with her grandfather's techniques. None of them had seemed particularly enthusiastic about the evaluation, but they'd all performed their roles competently. "They seemed to be following orders, ma'am. Professional soldiers doing what they were told to do, though." Emily hesitated, then decided to continue. "Sergeant Murphy made some comments that suggested he knew more about my family history than I would have expected." "What kind of comments?" "He mentioned my grandfather by name and indicated that he'd learned techniques from people who'd trained with him. It suggested a level of background knowledge that seemed unusual for a routine evaluation." Chen's expression grew more serious. "Sergeant Murphy has an interesting background. Former SEAL, multiple classified deployments, connections to various special programs that don't officially exist. If he knew details about your grandfather's training, it suggests someone briefed him specifically for this evaluation." The conversation was interrupted by a sharp knock on the door. Chen looked at Emily, who shrugged and called out, "Come in." The door opened to reveal Captain Rodriguez, again his face flushed with excitement and concern. "Sorry to interrupt, but you need to see this." He held up his phone, showing a news website. CNN just picked up the story. Female soldier defeats five men in viral combat video. It's everywhere: Fox News, MSNBC, military blogs, social media. This has gone way beyond Fort Bragg. Emily felt the blood drain from her face. What had started as a private humiliation designed to end her career had become a national news story, complete with video evidence and commentary from people who'd never served a day in uniform. She could already imagine the think pieces, the political debates, the way her personal moment would be dissected and analyzed by strangers with agendas she couldn't control. Chen stood up, at her expression grim. "Captain, I need you to coordinate with base communications. We need to get ahead of this story before it spirals completely out of control." "Ma'am, it may already be too late for that. The video has over 1 million views and counting. Our Emily 83 seconds is trending on Twitter. Someone even created a Wikipedia page about her." Emily sank down onto her bed, overwhelmed by the speed at which her life was changing. This morning she'd been a decorated but relatively anonymous sniper. Now she was apparently a viral sensation whose actions were being debated by people across the country. "Sergeant Vance," Chen said, her voice gentle but firm. "I know this feels overwhelming, but I need you to stay focused. The investigation into this morning's events is going to be thorough, and there are going to be a lot of people asking questions. Some of them will be on your side, others won't be. The most important thing is that you continue to conduct yourself with the same professionalism you've always shown." "Yes, ma'am." "There's something else you should know. Given the public attention this is receiving, the Inspector General's office is going to expedite our investigation. We'll have preliminary findings within 72 hours, and I suspect there will be significant consequences for everyone involved." Rodriguez cleared his throat. "Ma'am, there's one more thing. Base Command has scheduled a press conference for 1800 hours. They're calling it a clarification of recent events, but everyone knows it's damage control." Chen's jaw tightened. "Who's giving the press conference?" "Colonel Morrison." The silence that followed was loaded with implication. Morrison, having failed to destroy Emily's career privately, was apparently planning to do so publicly. A press conference would give him the opportunity to control the narrative, to spin the evaluation as a legitimate assessment that Emily had passed, but which raised questions about proper procedures and safety protocols. "That's interesting timing," Chen observed. "Colonel Morrison is holding a press conference about an evaluation that's currently under investigation by the Inspector General's office. That shows either remarkable confidence or remarkable desperation." Emily's phone buzzed with another notification, this one from her unit commander, requesting her immediate presence at headquarters. The message was terse and formal, suggesting that the ripple effects of the morning's events were spreading through the chain of command. "Looks like I'm being summoned," Emily said, showing the message to Chen. "I'll walk with you. Captain Rodriguez, continue monitoring the media coverage and prepare a summary for my office. I want to know exactly how this story is being portrayed and who's driving the narrative." As they left the barracks, Emily was struck by how different the base felt compared to just a few hours earlier. Soldiers who normally would have offered casual greetings now stared openly, their expressions ranging from admiration to curiosity to something that might have been concern. She could hear fragments of conversations as they passed groups of personnel. Never seen anything like it. "Morrison's going to be furious. Heard she learned it from her grandfather. Think this changes anything about women in combat." The walk to headquarters normally took 10 minutes, but today it felt like a gauntlet. Emily found herself unconsciously adjusting her posture, straightening her shoulders, and focusing her gaze forward. If she was going to be the center of attention, she was determined to carry herself like the professional soldier she'd always been. They were halfway across the main parade ground when Emily spotted another familiar figure approaching Sergeant Murphy, still moving somewhat stiffly from their encounter in the conference room. He intercepted their path, his expression serious. "Sergeant Vance, Colonel Chen," he said, nodding respectfully to both women. "Could I have a word?" Chen looked at Emily, who nodded. "Go ahead, Sergeant." Murphy glanced around, ensuring they weren't being overheard. "I wanted to apologize for my part in this morning's events, and I wanted to give you both some information that might be relevant to any upcoming investigations." "What kind of information?" Chen asked. "The kind that suggests this evaluation wasn't Colonel Morrison's idea alone. I received specific briefing materials about Sergeant Vance's background and training 3 days ago, materials that included details about her grandfather's service record that aren't in any official database." Emily felt that familiar chill again. "What do you mean, not in any official database?" Murphy's expression grew more serious. "I mean details about classified programs, unconventional training methods, and personnel records that were supposedly sealed or destroyed decades ago. Someone with very high clearance levels and access to extremely sensitive information wanted me to know exactly what I might be facing in that room. Chen pulled out her tablet and began taking notes. Who provided these briefing materials? That's the interesting part. They came through official channels, but the original source was listed as Classification Review Board. When I tried to follow up on some of the details, I was told that any questions should be directed to the Pentagon's Special Access Program Office. The implications were staggering. If Murphy was telling the truth, then the evaluation hadn't just been Morrison's attempt to humiliate Emily. It had been part of something much larger involving people with access to information that should have been buried for decades. Sergeant Murphy, Chen said carefully, are you saying that someone at the Pentagon level was involved in planning this morning's evaluation? I'm saying that someone with Pentagon-level access provided information that was used to plan this morning's evaluation. Whether that constitutes involvement is above my pay grade to determine. Emily's mind was racing, trying to process the connections Murphy was suggesting. Her grandfather's training, the mysterious text message she'd received, Morrison's confident demeanor, despite the obvious risks of his plan, it all suggested a conspiracy that went far beyond one colonel's personal prejudices. They reached headquarters to find an unusual level of activity for a Tuesday afternoon. Military vehicles were parked outside that Emily didn't recognize, including several with government plates that suggested visitors from outside the base. Through the building's windows, she could see personnel moving with the kind of urgent purpose that usually indicated either a crisis or a high-level inspection. Looks like we're not the only ones interested in this morning's events, Chen observed. As they climbed the steps to the main entrance, Emily caught sight of Morrison through one of the windows. He was in what appeared to be an intense conversation with two men in civilian clothes, both of whom carried themselves with the kind of authority that suggested federal law enforcement or intelligence agencies. Colonel Chen, Emily said quietly, I'm starting to think I'm in way over my head. Chen paused at the entrance, her expression sympathetic but firm. Sergeant, you were in over your head the moment you walked into that conference room this morning. The question now is whether you're going to let that intimidate you or whether you're going to see this through to whatever conclusion awaits. Emily thought about her grandfather, about the techniques he'd taught her, not just for combat but for life, about persistence in the face of overwhelming odds, about standing up for what was right even when it cost everything, about the responsibility that came with exceptional capabilities. I'll see it through, ma'am. Good, because I have a feeling this is just the beginning. As they entered the building, Emily couldn't shake the feeling that the next few hours would determine not just her own future, but something much larger. The evaluation had ended, but the real test was just beginning. The headquarters building's air conditioning felt arctic compared to the humid Carolina heat, but Emily barely noticed the temperature change as they walked through corridors buzzing with unusual activity. Staff officers who normally moved with leisurely bureaucratic pace were practically jogging between offices, their arms full of files and their faces tight with stress. Whatever was happening, it was big enough to mobilize the entire command structure. Chen led Emily past the main reception area toward the executive wing, where Colonel Morrison's office occupied a corner suite overlooking the parade ground. As they approached, Emily could hear raised voices through the heavy wooden door. Morrison's gravelly baritone, punctuated by at least two other men speaking in clipped professional tones that suggested federal authority. Completely unacceptable breach of operational security, one of the voices was saying. This was supposed to be contained, controlled, and classified. Instead, it's trending on social media platforms worldwide. Morrison's response was defensive but strained. The assessment was conducted according to approved parameters. We had no way of predicting that unauthorized recording would occur. You had no way of predicting. The second unfamiliar voice carried a note of incredulous anger. Colonel, you arranged for 5 soldiers to engage in hand-to-hand combat with a female staff sergeant in a room with a glass door during peak activity hours. What exactly did you think would happen? Chen raised her hand, signaling Emily to wait, and knocked firmly on the door. The conversation inside ceased immediately. "Come in," Morrison called out, his voice noticeably strained. Chen opened the door and stepped inside, with Emily following. The office, normally spacious and well-appointed, felt cramped with the addition of the two civilian visitors. Both men were middle-aged, wearing dark suits that screamed federal government and carrying themselves with the kind of rigid posture that suggested military backgrounds despite their current civilian status. Morrison swooped behind his desk, looking like a man who'd aged a decade in the past few hours. His normally immaculate uniform was wrinkled, his face was flushed, and there was a tremor in his hands that Emily had never noticed before. The two civilians stood near the window, their positions allowing them to observe both Morrison and anyone who entered the office. "Colonel Morrison," Chen said formally, "I believe you requested Staff Sergeant Vance's presence." The taller of the two civilians stepped forward, extending his hand to Chen. "Lieutenant Colonel Chen, I presume I'm Agent Davidson from the Defense Intelligence Agency. This is Agent Brooks from the Pentagon's Special Access Programs Office. We need to speak with Sergeant Vance about this morning's incident." Emily felt her stomach drop. DIA and Special Access Programs meant that this situation had escalated far beyond a simple base-level investigation. These were the people who dealt with classified operation security breaches and situations that could affect national security. Their presence suggested that her 83-second performance had implications she was only beginning to understand. "Sergeant Vance," Agent Davidson continued, "please have a seat. We have some questions about your background and training that we hope you can help clarify." Emily remained standing, her military-bearing automatic, despite the growing sense of being trapped in something much larger than herself. "Sir, I believe I should have legal representation present before answering questions from federal investigators." Agent Brooks smiled thinly. "This isn't a criminal investigation, Sergeant. We're simply trying to understand how you acquired certain capabilities that weren't part of your official military training record." "What capabilities would those be, sir?" Davidson pulled out a tablet and scrolled through several files. "According to the video evidence we've reviewed, you demonstrated combat techniques that aren't taught in any current military curriculum. Some of the methods you employed appear to be derived from classified training programs that were discontinued decades ago." Emily felt the room spinning slightly. "I'm not sure what you mean, sir." "Sergeant Murphy provided us with a detailed report of his engagement with you. He specifically identified 3 techniques that he recognized from his own specialized training techniques that were part of a classified program called Project Ghostwalker that officially ended in 1987. The name hit Emily like a physical blow. Project Ghostwalker had been one of her grandfather's stories, one of the programs he'd mentioned in passing during their training sessions, but had always refused to discuss in detail. She'd assumed it was just another piece of military folklore, the kind of legend that grew around special operations units over time. "Sir, I've never heard of Project Ghostwalker." Agent Brooks stepped closer, his expression skeptical. "Sergeant, your grandfather, Master Sergeant William Vance, was one of the primary instructors for Ghostwalker from 1983 to 1987. According to his service record, the classified portions that most people don't have access to, he was specifically tasked with developing and teaching hand-to-hand combat techniques derived from various international martial arts traditions." Emily's mouth went dry. Her grandfather had taught her dozens of techniques over the years, always framing them as family traditions or things he'd picked up during his travels. She'd never imagined that they might be part of official military programs, especially classified ones. Chen cleared her throat. "Agents, I need to remind you that Sergeant Vance is currently the subject of an Inspector General investigation regarding this morning's evaluation. Any questioning should be coordinated through proper channels." Davidson nodded. "We're aware of your investigation, Colonel Chen. In fact, we're here partly because of it. The publicity surrounding today's events has brought attention to programs and capabilities that were supposed to remain classified indefinitely. Morrison finally spoke up, his voice hoarse. The evaluation was designed to assess Sergeant Vance's combat readiness for potential special operations assignments. There was nothing irregular about the procedures. Colonel, Brooks said with barely concealed contempt, "You arranged for a staff sergeant to demonstrate classified combat techniques in front of cameras that you knew would be recording. Whether intentionally or through gross negligence, you've compromised operational security on a level that could require congressional briefings." The implications were staggering. Emily realized that her victory in the conference room hadn't just embarrassed Morrison or violated his assumptions about women in combat. It had potentially exposed classified military capabilities to public scrutiny. The video that was currently trending on social media wasn't just entertainment. It was a security breach. "What exactly are you asking of me?" Emily said, finding her voice. Davidson consulted his tablet again. "We need to understand the full extent of your training. What techniques did your grandfather teach you? How much do you know about Project Ghostwalker and related programs? And most importantly, have you shared any of this information with unauthorized personnel?" Emily thought about the years of training with her grandfather, the countless hours spent learning techniques that he'd always described as family traditions. She thought about the stories he'd told about his service, the careful way he'd always avoided certain details, and the warnings he'd given her about being careful who she trusted, with knowledge that could be dangerous in the wrong hands. "My grandfather taught me self-defense techniques that he said had been in our family for generations. He never mentioned any classified programs or government connections. As far as I knew, everything I learned was just family knowledge." Brooks and Davidson exchanged glances that suggested they didn't entirely believe her answer. Brooks pulled out his own tablet and scrolled through memorable documents. "Sergeant, according to personnel records, your grandfather submitted a formal request in 1988 to continue teaching certain techniques to family members after his retirement. That request was approved by the Secretary of Defense himself, with the stipulation that any techniques taught would be considered classified information subject to standard security protocols." Emily felt the ground shifting beneath her feet. "I was never briefed on any security protocols. I was never told that anything my grandfather taught me was classified." "That's because the briefing was supposed to come when you turned 18, Davidson said. "According to the documentation, your grandfather was supposed to inform you of the classified nature of your training and arrange for you to receive appropriate security clearances before you enlisted. But he died when I was 17. The silence that followed was heavy with implication. Emily's grandfather had passed away suddenly from a heart attack just months before her 18th birthday, taking with him not just a beloved family member, but apparently critical information about the true nature of her training. Chen stepped forward. "Agents, what you're describing suggests that Sergeant Vance has been unknowingly in possession of classified information for over a decade. If that's the case, the fault lies with the system that failed to provide appropriate oversight, not with her." "We understand that, Colonel Chen," Davidson said, "but the fact remains that classified techniques are now in the public domain through viral video footage. We need to assess the scope of the potential compromise and determine appropriate next steps." Morrison, who had been increasingly agitated throughout the conversation, suddenly slammed his hand on his desk. "This is ridiculous. She's one soldier who got lucky in a hand-to-hand exercise. You're talking about congressional briefings and security breaches over a barracks room brawl that got out of hand." Agent Brooks turned to Morrison with an expression of barely controlled anger. "Colonel, one soldier who got lucky doesn't defeat five elite combatants using techniques that were developed by special operations units and cost the taxpayers millions of dollars to research and develop. What we saw on that video represents capabilities that our adversaries would pay significant sums to understand and counter. The room fell silent as the full weight of Brooks's words settled over everyone present. Emily realized that her morning's work hadn't just been about proving herself or surviving Morrison's trap. It had been an inadvertent demonstration of American military capabilities that were never supposed to be seen by foreign intelligence services. Emily's phone buzzed with another notification, and she glanced at the screen to see a text from an unknown international number. "Impressive demonstration. We should meet." She quickly silenced the phone, but not before Agent Davidson noticed her reaction. "Something wrong, Sergeant." Emily hesitated, then decided that honesty was her best option given the circumstances. "I've been receiving messages from unknown numbers since the video went viral. This one appears to be from an international sender." Davidson and Brooks exchanged sharp looks. "May we see the message?" Emily handed over her phone, watching as both agents examined the text with obvious concern. Davidson immediately began typing on his own device, presumably alerting other federal agencies to the development. "Sergeant Vance," Brooks said gravely, "you need to understand that this situation has moved well beyond a simple base-level incident. Foreign intelligence services monitor American social media for exactly this kind of information. If they've identified you as someone with access to advanced combat techniques, you could become a target for recruitment, kidnapping, or worse." The casual mention of kidnapping sent a chill through Emily that had nothing to do with the air conditioning. She'd signed up to face enemy soldiers on foreign battlefields, not to become a target for foreign spies because of a viral video. Chen looked at her tablet, which had been buzzing with notifications throughout the conversation. "Agents, this situation is evolving rapidly. I'm receiving reports that the story has been picked up by international news outlets. BBC Deutsche Welle and Al Jazeera are all running segments about the American female super soldier who defeated 5 men in combat." "Super soldier," Emily said weakly. "The media loves a narrative," Davidson said grimly, "and a small woman defeating multiple larger opponents using mysterious techniques is exactly the kind of story that captures global attention. Unfortunately, it's also the kind of story that captures the attention of people we'd rather not have interested in our military capabilities." Morrison, perhaps sensing that his own situation was deteriorating rapidly, attempted to regain control of the conversation. "The evaluation was conducted under my authority as base commander. Any consequences should fall on me, not on Sergeant Vance." Brooks turned to Morrison with an expression that could have melted steel. "Colonel, your negligence has potentially compromised classified military programs, exposed a valuable intelligence asset to foreign scrutiny, and created a public relations nightmare that could affect military recruitment and policy decisions. The consequences are going to fall on everyone involved, but you're going to bear the heaviest burden." Agent Davidson's phone rang, and he stepped aside to take the call. Emily could hear only fragments of the conversation, but the words "Pentagon," "briefing," and "immediately" came through clearly. When he returned to the group, his expression was even more serious than before. "We need to move quickly," he announced. "The Secretary of Defense wants a full briefing on this situation within 2 hours. Colonel Chen, your investigation is being elevated to federal level with immediate effect. Colonel Morrison, you're being relieved of command pending a full review of your actions and judgment." Morrison's face went pale. "You can't do that." "I'm a commissioned officer with 26 years of service. I demand—" "You demand nothing," Brooks interrupted. "Your actions have created a security situation that could affect national interests. You're lucky that relief of command is the only immediate consequence you're facing." Emily watched Morrison's career implode in real time, feeling a mixture of satisfaction and pity. The man had tried to destroy her through bureaucratic manipulation and had instead destroyed himself through poor judgment and worse planning. But there was no triumph in watching another soldier's downfall, even one who had been her enemy. Chen closed her tablet and stood up. Agents, what do you need from Sergeant Vance going forward? Complete debriefing on everything her grandfather taught her. Full documentation of all techniques she's learned and their potential origins. And immediate placement in protective custody until we can assess the extent of foreign interest in her capabilities. Protective custody, Emily said, alarm bells going off in her head. Davidson's expression was sympathetic but firm. Sergeant, you've become a person of interest to intelligence agencies around the world. Until we can fully assess the situation and implement appropriate countermeasures, we need to ensure your safety and security. Emily thought about the text message waiting for her at range 19, about Murphy's strange knowledge of her grandfather's history, and about the growing sense that forces she didn't understand were moving around her. Protective custody might be presented as being for her safety, but it would also effectively isolate her from any allies or resources she might need. How long would this protective custody last? That depends on how quickly we can resolve the security issues and assess the full scope of the compromise, Brooks said. Could be days, could be weeks. Emily felt the trap closing around her from a different direction. Morrison's evaluation had failed to destroy her, but the federal response to her success might accomplish the same goal through different means. Protective custody could easily become indefinite detention if someone decided she knew too much or represented too great a risk. Chen seemed to recognize Emily's growing alarm. Agents, I need to point out that Sergeant Vance hasn't been charged with any crimes and hasn't been found guilty of any security violations. Any protective custody arrangement would need to respect her rights as both a citizen and a soldier. Of course, Davidson said, but his tone suggested that Emily's rights were secondary to national security concerns. We're simply trying to protect a valuable asset while we sort out the implications of today's events. The word asset struck Emily like a slap. She'd gone from decorated soldier to viral sensation to security risk to valuable asset, all in the span of a few hours. None of those labels felt like they described the person she actually was, a soldier who'd simply done her job and tried to maintain her honor in the face of an unfair challenge. Emily's phone buzzed again, this time with a call from her unit commander. She showed the screen to Agent Davidson, who nodded permission for her to answer. Staff Sergeant Vance? Emily, it's Major Harrison. I need you back at the unit immediately. We've got Pentagon brass inbound, and they're asking specifically for you. Also, there's been a development with the press conference that you need to know about. Emily could hear tension in her commander's voice that went beyond the usual stress of dealing with higher headquarters. What kind of development, sir? Morrison's press conference has been canceled. Base command is saying it's due to evolving circumstances, but rumor control says he's been relieved of command. Also, we've got reporters from major networks setting up outside the main gate. This thing has gone completely national. Emily looked around the room at the federal agents and her superior officers, all of whom were watching her conversation with obvious interest. The walls were definitely closing in, and she was running out of options. Sir, I'm currently in a meeting with federal investigators. I'll need to coordinate my schedule through them. Federal investigators. Harrison's voice rose slightly. Emily, what the hell have you gotten yourself into? That was exactly the question Emily wished she could answer. I'm not entirely sure, sir, but I think it's bigger than any of us realized. She ended the call and looked around the room again. Davidson and Brooks were already discussing logistics in low voices. Chen was taking notes that would probably become part of an official report, and Morrison was staring out the window with the expression of a man watching his career burn to the ground. Agents, Emily said, making a decision that she hoped she wouldn't regret. I'm willing to cooperate fully with your investigation, but I need some guarantees about my rights and my future in the military. I didn't ask for any of this, and I won't be made a scapegoat for decisions that other people made. Davidson and Brooks stopped their conversation and turned to face her. What kind of guarantees? I want legal representation present for any formal debriefings. I want assurance that my cooperation won't be used against me in any disciplinary proceedings, and I want confirmation that my military career won't be derailed because of knowledge I possessed unknowingly." Brooks nodded slowly. "Those seem like reasonable requests. We'll need to coordinate with military legal services, but I don't see any fundamental obstacles." "There's one more thing," Emily said, thinking about the mysterious text message and the growing certainty that there were still pieces of this puzzle she didn't understand. "I want to know the truth about my grandfather's involvement in these classified programs. If I'm going to be held responsible for knowledge I inherited from him, I deserve to know the full story of how he acquired that knowledge and why he passed it on to me." The two agents exchanged glances that suggested Emily had touched on something they weren't prepared to discuss. Davidson consulted his tablet again, scrolling through documents that Emily couldn't see. "Sergeant Vance," he said carefully, "your grandfather's service record contains information that's classified at levels above our current discussion. Accessing that information would require additional clearances and approvals that could take time to obtain." "How much time?" "Weeks, possibly months." Emily felt frustration building in her chest. Every answer seemed to lead to more questions, and every question seemed to require additional bureaucratic hurdles. She was beginning to understand why her grandfather had chosen to frame his knowledge as family tradition rather than deal with the federal machinery that surrounded classified information. Chen's tablet chimed with an urgent notification, and she frowned as she read the message. "This is interesting. I'm getting reports that the YouTube video has been taken down by government request. All the major social media platforms are removing copies as they appear." "About time," Brooks muttered, shamed, "though the damage is probably already done." "Actually," Chen continued, "the removal seems to be having the opposite effect. People are talking about government censorship and cover-ups." Emily 8 seconds is trending even higher now, and conspiracy theories are starting to spread about what the government is trying to hide. Emily closed her eyes and tried to imagine what her life was going to look like going forward. She'd wanted to serve her country with honor and distinction, to prove that women could excel in combat roles, and to build on the legacy her grandfather had left her. Instead, she was becoming the center of a viral controversy that was spiraling beyond anyone's control. When she opened her eyes, she found everyone in the room watching her with expressions ranging from sympathy to calculation. She was clearly the key piece in a puzzle that no one fully understood, but she was also the piece that everyone needed to control in order to protect their own interests. "All right," she said, straightening her shoulders and drawing on reserves of strength that her grandfather had helped her build years ago. "Let's figure out how to solve this, but we do it together with full disclosure and mutual respect. I won't be anyone's asset or anyone's scapegoat. I'm a soldier, and I expect to be treated like one." Agent Davidson smiled for the first time since entering the room. "Sergeant Vance, I think we can work with that." As the group began planning their next steps, Emily couldn't shake the feeling that the real challenges were just beginning. The evaluation had lasted 83 seconds, but its consequences were going to shape the rest of her life. The meeting broke up with the efficiency of a military operation, everyone moving with the urgent purpose that comes when national security concerns override normal bureaucratic procedures. Agent Davidson coordinated with base security to establish a protective detail for Emily, while Agent Brooks worked his phone to arrange transportation and briefing schedules with Pentagon officials. Chen gathered her investigation files, now elevated to federal priority, and Morrison sat in stunned silence as his aide arrived to escort him to what would likely be his final meeting as base commander. Emily found herself in the surreal position of being the center of all this activity while feeling completely powerless to influence its direction. The protective detail consisted of 2 military police officers who looked like they'd been pulled from a recruitment poster, young, serious, and obviously briefed to treat her as both a VIP and a potential security risk. They maintained a respectful distance, but made it clear that her movements would be carefully monitored and controlled. "Sergeant Vance," Agent Davidson said, as the group prepared to leave Morrison's office. "We'll need you to pack a bag. You'll be staying in secure quarters tonight while we arrange for your transport to Washington tomorrow." Washington. Emily felt her stomach drop. "I thought this was going to be handled here at Bragg." "The Secretary of Defense wants to personally review this situation," Brooks explained. "Given the international attention and potential security implications, this has become a Pentagon-level priority." Emily thought about the text message waiting for her at Range 19 about Murphy's knowledge of her grandfather's classified background and about the growing sense that there were still crucial pieces of information being withheld from her. If she was taken to Washington tomorrow, she might never get the answers she needed to understand what was really happening. "Agents, I need to stop by my quarters to pack and make some personal arrangements. Will that be possible?" Davidson nodded. "Of course. Your protective detail will accompany you, but you'll have privacy to handle personal matters." As they left the headquarters building, Emily was struck by how dramatically the atmosphere on base had changed since the morning. Groups of soldiers stood in clusters throughout the area, their conversation stopping abruptly when they spotted her. Some offered respectful nods or even applause, while others watched with the kind of curiosity usually reserved for visiting celebrities or exotic animals. The walk back to her barracks felt like a parade route, with soldiers emerging from buildings and vehicles to catch a glimpse of the woman who'd defeated 5 men in 83 seconds. Emily tried to maintain her normal military bearing, but the constant attention made her feel like she was wearing a costume rather than a uniform. One of her protective detail, a young sergeant named Collins, walked slightly ahead while scanning for potential threats. "Ma'am," he said quietly, "I wanted you to know that most of the enlisted personnel are really proud of what you did today. Not many people would have had the courage to face that kind of setup." "Thank you, Sergeant. I appreciate that." "My sister's trying to get into the Rangers program," Collins continued. "She's been dealing with a lot of people telling her she's not strong enough or tough enough. When she sees what you did today, it's going to mean a lot to her." Emily felt a weight settling on her shoulders that had nothing to do with her equipment. She'd become a symbol for people she'd never met, representing possibilities and challenges that she'd never consciously chosen to embrace. The responsibility was both humbling and terrifying. They reached her barracks to find a small crowd of soldiers gathered outside, some holding phones and obviously hoping for photos or video. The second member of her protective detail, a staff sergeant named Rodriguez, quickly dispersed the crowd with the kind of authority that suggested extensive experience with crowd control. "Ma'am, we'll wait outside while you pack," Rodriguez said. "Take your time, but please remember that we need to maintain security protocols." Emily climbed the stairs to her room, each step feeling heavier than the last. The small space that had felt like a refuge this morning now felt like a cage, with its single window overlooking the base, where hundreds of people were now discussing her actions and their implications. She sat on her bed and pulled out her personal phone, scrolling through the dozens of missed calls and messages that had accumulated throughout the day. Reporters, old unit members, family, friends, and complete strangers had all somehow obtained her number and wanted to share their thoughts about her sudden fame. One message caught her attention. It was from her Aunt Sarah, her grandfather's daughter, and the only family member who'd really understood the depth of William Vance's military background. "Emily, I've been watching the news and I'm worried about you. There are things about your grandfather's service that you need to know, things he made me promise never to discuss unless something like this happened. Call me when you can, but be careful who might be listening. Some secrets are kept for good reasons." Emily stared at the message, feeling another piece of the puzzle clicking into place. Her Aunt Sarah had always been evasive about their grandfather's military career, deflecting questions with vague answers about classified assignments and the need to focus on the future rather than the past. Now it seemed like Sarah had been protecting information that Emily desperately needed. She was about to call her aunt when her phone buzzed with another text from the unknown number that had contacted her earlier. Range 19, 2200 hours. Come alone or you'll never understand why your grandfather really died. The words hit Emily like a physical blow. Her grandfather had died of a heart attack, sudden, unexpected, but medically explainable. The suggestion that there might be more to his death than natural causes opened up possibilities that Emily wasn't sure she was prepared to consider. She quickly typed a response, "Who is this?" The reply came immediately. "Someone who knew William Vance before he became your grandfather. Someone who knows why Project Ghostwalker was really terminated. And someone who knows that today's evaluation wasn't Morrison's idea." Emily felt the room spinning slightly. Every answer seemed to reveal new questions, each more disturbing than the last. If Morrison hadn't been the mastermind behind the evaluation, then who had been? And why had they wanted her to demonstrate capabilities that were supposed to remain classified? A knock on her door interrupted her thoughts. "Ma'am, you have a visitor," Sergeant Collins called out. "Agent Davidson wants to speak with you." Emily quickly deleted the message thread and opened the door to find Davidson standing in the hallway with a concerned expression. "Sergeant Vance, we've intercepted communications suggesting that foreign intelligence services are actively seeking to make contact with you. Have you received any unusual messages or calls since this morning?" Emily hesitated for a split second, then decided that partial truth was better than an outright lie. "I've received several messages from numbers I don't recognize, but I assumed they were from reporters or people who'd seen the video. We're going to need to examine your phone to determine if any of those contacts represent security risks," Davidson said. "I know it's an invasion of privacy, but given the circumstances, we need to be thorough." Emily felt panic rising in her chest. If Davidson's people examined her phone, they'd find the messages about Range 19 and her grandfather's death, along with her aunt's cryptic warning about secrets that needed to be protected. She needed time to understand what was happening before federal agents took control of the narrative. "Agent Davidson, I understand the security concerns, but I also have rights as both a soldier and a citizen. I'd like to consult with legal counsel before turning over personal communications." Davidson's expression suggested that he'd expected this response. "That's reasonable, but it will need to happen quickly. We can't afford to have potential security breaches developing while we navigate legal procedures." "I understand. Can you give me until tomorrow morning? I'd like to contact a military lawyer and make sure I understand my obligations and protections." "Given that we're transporting you to Washington tomorrow afternoon, that timeline works. But Sergeant Vance, I need your word that you won't attempt to contact any unknown numbers or respond to suspicious communications without clearing it through us first." Emily nodded, hoping that her expression didn't reveal the conflict between her promise and her growing need to understand what was really happening. "You have my word, sir." After Davidson left, Emily quickly packed a small bag with enough clothes and personal items for several days in Washington. She included her grandfather's service medals and the one photo she had of him in combat gear, hoping that they might provide clues or comfort during what was likely to be a difficult period. As evening fell, Emily found herself in the base dining facility, surrounded by her protective detail and feeling more isolated than she had since her grandfather's death. Conversations at nearby tables stopped whenever she appeared, replaced by whispered discussions and pointed stares. She'd become a curiosity, a symbol, and a security risk all at once. Sergeant Collins, who seemed to have appointed himself as her informal liaison, sat across from her, picking at a turkey sandwich. "Ma'am, can I ask you something?" "Go ahead, Sergeant." "Do you regret it? What you did this morning, I mean, given how complicated everything's become?" Emily considered the question while watching other soldiers navigate around their table as if she were radioactive. "I regret that it became a public spectacle. I regret that people I respect are facing consequences for decisions they didn't make, but I don't regret defending myself or proving that I belong in uniform, even if it means you might not get to serve in the same way anymore." That was the heart of her fear that her moment of triumph would ultimately cost her the military career she'd worked so hard to build. "A soldier adapts to changing circumstances, Sergeant. Whatever happens next, I'll find a way to serve with honor." Collins nodded approvingly. "My sister's going to like hearing that." After dinner, Emily was escorted to temporary quarters in the base's VIP housing, a small apartment normally reserved for visiting dignitaries and senior officers. The space was comfortable but sterile, with generic furniture and no personal touches. Her protective detail established positions outside while she settled in for what she assumed would be her last night at Fort Bragg for the foreseeable future. She tried calling her Aunt Sarah, but the call went straight to voicemail. Emily left a brief message asking Sarah to call back, but didn't mention the specific circumstances that had prompted her inquiry. If federal agents were monitoring communications, she didn't want to put her aunt at risk. At 21:30 hours, Emily made a decision that she knew was risky but felt necessary. She needed answers that only the mysterious contact at Range 19 could provide, and tomorrow's trip to Washington would effectively end her ability to seek those answers independently. The protective detail was professional, but not insurmountable. She'd spent years learning to move unseen through hostile territory, and Fort Bragg was hardly that. Emily changed into dark civilian clothes and soft-soled shoes, then carefully examined the apartment's layout. The building had been constructed in the 1960s, with basic security features that were more symbolic than functional. The bathroom window was small but adequate for someone of her size, and it opened onto an area that wasn't directly visible from the protective detail's positions. She left a lamp on and positioned pillows under her blanket to create the silhouette of someone sleeping, then quietly opened the bathroom window and slipped into the Carolina night. The humid air felt thick after the apartment's air conditioning and the sounds of the base at night. Distant generators, radio chatter, the occasional vehicle provided cover for her movement. Range 19 was located on the far side of the base, about 2 miles from her temporary quarters. Emily moved through shadows and between buildings using terrain features and her knowledge of patrol schedules to avoid detection. The route took her past areas where she'd trained as a young soldier, bringing back memories of simpler times when her biggest concern was qualifying on the rifle range. The old training facility behind Range 19 had been abandoned for several years, its buildings slowly surrendering to Carolina weather and vegetation. Emily approached carefully, every sense alert for signs of ambush or surveillance. The main building's windows were dark, but she could see a faint light coming from what had once been an instructor's office. She made her way to the building's side entrance, testing the door handle and finding it unlocked. The interior smelled of dust and decay, with moonlight filtering through broken windows to illuminate empty corridors and abandoned equipment. Emily moved toward the light source, her hand instinctively checking for weapons she wasn't carrying. The office door was open, revealing a single figure seated behind an old metal desk. Emily recognized him immediately. It was Sergeant Murphy, still wearing his combat uniform, but with his rank insignia removed. A battery-powered lantern provided the only illumination, casting harsh shadows across his scarred features. "I wondered if you'd come," Murphy said, without looking up from a folder he was examining. "Most people in your situation would choose safety over answers. Most people in my situation wouldn't have been trained by William Vance," Emily replied, stepping into the office but remaining near the door. "You said you knew my grandfather. You said you knew why he really died." Murphy finally looked up, his expression grave. "I didn't just know your grandfather, Sergeant Vance. I served under him. Project Ghostwalker wasn't terminated in 1987. It was transferred to special access programs and classified at levels that don't officially exist. Your grandfather didn't retire from the Army. He was reassigned to a compartmentalized unit that worked on developing countermeasures to foreign martial arts programs. Emily felt the ground shifting beneath her feet again. What foreign programs? During the Cold War, both the Soviets and the Chinese were experimenting with enhanced combat training techniques. Some of it was legitimate martial arts instruction, but there were also programs that combined traditional fighting methods with psychological conditioning and pharmaceutical enhancement. The U.S. military needed people who could understand and counter those techniques. Murphy opened the folder and spread several photographs across the desk. Emily could see images of her grandfather with various groups of soldiers, some in American uniforms and others in civilian clothes that suggested international cooperation. William Vance was one of the primary researchers and instructors for the American Response Program. He learned techniques from masters around the world, then developed training curricula that could be taught to special operations personnel. But the program was shut down in 1994 after a series of incidents that convinced the Pentagon that the techniques were too dangerous for widespread use. What kind of incidents? Murphy's expression darkened. Soldiers who became too efficient at killing, personnel who couldn't distinguish between training scenarios and real combat situations. A few cases of techniques being used against American personnel during training exercises that resulted in permanent injuries or death. Emily thought about her grandfather's careful instruction, the way he'd always emphasized control and restraint along with effectiveness. My grandfather taught me to never use these techniques unless my life was in danger, because he understood what could happen when they were used carelessly. William Vance was one of the few instructors who insisted on psychological and ethical training alongside the physical techniques. When the program was terminated, he was one of the people tasked with ensuring that the knowledge didn't disappear entirely. Murphy pulled out another document, this one bearing official seals and classification markings. Your grandfather was given permission to pass selected techniques to family members, but only under strict conditions. The recipients had to be psychologically evaluated, sworn to secrecy, and monitored for signs of misuse. He was supposed to bring you into the program formally when you turned 18. But he died when I was 17. He was killed when you were 17, Murphy corrected quietly. William Vance didn't die of natural causes, Emily. He was murdered by someone who wanted to prevent you from learning the full truth about your heritage and your capabilities. The words hit Emily like a physical blow, and she gripped the doorframe for support. That's impossible. He had a heart attack. There were medical records and autopsy. There were falsified medical records, and a corrupted autopsy performed by a coroner who was later found to have connections to foreign intelligence services, Murphy said gently. The investigation was classified and the findings were buried, but your grandfather was killed because someone wanted to ensure that his knowledge died with him. Emily's mind raced through the implications. If her grandfather had been murdered, then her inheritance of his techniques hadn't been an accident. It had been something that someone had tried to prevent. And if that knowledge was valuable enough to kill, for then her demonstration of those techniques this morning had potentially marked her for the same fate. Who killed him? She asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Murphy closed the folder and leaned back in his chair. That's where things get complicated. The investigation suggested foreign involvement, but there were also indications that some American personnel might have been compromised. People who had access to classified information about Project Ghostwalker and the locations of former program participants, like Colonel Morrison. Morrison was a junior officer at the time, but he was assigned to units that had oversight responsibilities for former Ghostwalker personnel. He would have known about your grandfather's background and your potential inheritance of classified techniques. Emily felt another piece of the puzzle clicking into place. This morning's evaluation wasn't about assessing my combat readiness. It was about forcing me to demonstrate techniques that would confirm what I knew. Partly, but I think it was also about creating a public record that could be used to justify whatever actions they're planning to take next. Murphy stood up and moved to the window, scanning the darkness outside. The fact that the evaluation was recorded the way it was structured to ensure maximum humiliation, someone wanted documented evidence of your capabilities. Evidence for what? Murphy turned back to face her, his expression grim. Emily, there are people in the government and the military who believe that the techniques your grandfather taught you are too dangerous to exist outside official control. They think that anyone with that knowledge should either be brought into classified programs or eliminated as a potential security risk. The casual mention of elimination sent ice through Emily's veins. You're talking about assassination. I'm talking about a shadow conflict that's been going on for decades between people who want to preserve dangerous knowledge and people who want to destroy it. Your grandfather was killed because he chose preservation. Today's evaluation was designed to force you to reveal yourself so that the same choice could be made about you. Emily thought about the federal agents, the protective custody, and the trip to Washington that had been arranged with such urgency. The people who want me in Washington, are they trying to protect me or control me? That depends on who's really giving the orders. Agent Davidson and Agent Brooks are probably sincere in their belief that they're protecting national security, but they're taking orders from people who might have very different agendas. Murphy moved back to the desk and pulled out a small device that looked like a modified cell phone. This is a secure communication device that's not connected to any government networks. If you find yourself in a situation where you can't trust official channels, use this to contact me. The number is programmed in as family friend. Emily took the device, noting its weight and unfamiliar design. How do I know I can trust you? Because I could have killed you a dozen times since you walked into this building, and instead, I'm trying to give you information that could save your life. Murphy's expression softened slightly. And because your grandfather saved my life in Somalia in 1993, and I owe him a debt that I can only repay by protecting his granddaughter. The mention of Somalia triggered a memory her grandfather had occasionally mentioned a deployment where he'd worked with special operations units on classified missions. He'd never provided details, but she remembered him saying that he'd learned as much about loyalty as he had about combat during that assignment. What should I do? The federal agents expect me to cooperate fully with their investigation. Cooperate, but don't trust everything they tell you. Keep your eyes open for signs that their protection is becoming imprisonment, and remember that not everyone in uniform is necessarily on your side. Murphy began gathering his documents and preparing to leave. There's one more thing you need to know. The techniques your grandfather taught you, they're not just family traditions or military programs. Some of them are derived from much older knowledge that certain groups have been trying to preserve or destroy for centuries. You're not just a soldier with unusual training, you're a guardian of something that goes back much further than Project Ghostwalker. Emily felt overwhelmed by the layers of conspiracy and hidden history that Murphy was revealing. How am I supposed to protect something when I don't even understand what it is? By staying alive, staying true to your principles, and trusting your instincts. Your grandfather spent years preparing you for challenges you didn't know you'd face. Trust that preparation. Murphy headed for the door, then paused and looked back. Emily, tomorrow in Washington, you're going to meet people who will try to convince you that cooperation is your only option. Remember that cooperation and surrender aren't the same thing. And remember that your grandfather chose to trust you with knowledge that others died trying to protect. As Murphy disappeared into the darkness, Emily remained in the abandoned office, trying to process everything she'd learned. Her grandfather's death hadn't been natural. The morning's evaluation had been part of a larger conspiracy, and she was now caught between forces that viewed her as either an asset or a threat. She made her way back across the base using the same careful approach that had brought her to Range 19, but her mind was focused on the challenges that awaited her in Washington. The protective custody that had been presented as temporary security might be the first step in a process designed to either recruit her or eliminate her as a potential problem. Emily slipped back into her temporary quarters through the bathroom window, changed back into sleeping clothes, and arranged herself in bed just as her protective detail conducted their hourly security check. Sergeant Collins's flashlight briefly illuminated her apparently sleeping form before he quietly closed the door and returned to his post. But Emily lay awake for hours, staring at the ceiling and thinking about her grandfather's murder, Murphy's warnings, and the secure communication device hidden in her packed bag. Tomorrow she would begin a journey that would take her far from the familiar environment of Fort Bragg and into a world where the stakes were measured in lives rather than careers. The 83 seconds that had changed everything were beginning to seem like the easy part. Dawn came too early, bringing with it the artificial brightness of fluorescent lights and the sound of her protective detail conducting their morning security briefing in the hallway outside her door. Emily had managed perhaps 2 hours of restless sleep, her mind cycling through Murphy's revelations about her grandfather's murder and the growing certainty that she was walking into a trap disguised as protective custody. She dressed in her service uniform, taking extra care with the details that had always been second nature: pressed creases, polished brass boots that reflected the overhead lights like mirrors. If she was going to face whatever awaited her in Washington, she would do it looking like the professional soldier she'd worked so hard to become. Sergeant Collins knocked softly at 0630. "Ma'am, Agent Davidson is here. They're ready to begin transport whenever you are." Emily shouldered her small duffel bag, feeling the weight of Murphy's secure communication device hidden among her personal belongings. "I'm ready, Sergeant." The hallway outside her quarters had been transformed into a staging area, with federal agents, military police, and base security personnel, creating overlapping layers of protection that seemed excessive for transporting one staff sergeant. Emily counted at least 8 personnel involved in what should have been a simple trip to the airfield, suggesting that someone was taking extraordinary precautions to ensure her safety or to ensure she couldn't escape. Agent Davidson approached with a professional smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "Good morning, Sergeant Vance. I hope you slept well." "Well enough, sir. Thank you." "Excellent. We have a military aircraft standing by to take us to Andrews Air Force Base, where we'll transfer to Pentagon transportation. The Secretary of Defense has cleared his morning schedule for your briefing." Emily nodded, noting the way Davidson's phrasing made it sound like the secretary had rearranged his day specifically to meet with her. The reality was probably that she was being fitted into whatever time slot could accommodate a security briefing about viral videos and potential intelligence compromises. The convoy to the airfield consisted of 3 black SUVs with tinted windows, the kind of official transportation that attracted attention rather than avoiding it. Emily found herself in the middle vehicle with Davidson and another agent she hadn't met, surrounded by enough firepower to handle a small insurgency. The level of security seemed designed more for psychological impact than practical necessity. During the 20-minute drive, Davidson briefed Emily on the day's schedule with the efficiency of someone accustomed to managing high-priority situations. "First stop will be the Pentagon for meetings with Defense Intelligence Agency leadership and representatives from special access programs. Then we'll have lunch with the Secretary of Defense and his senior staff. This afternoon includes sessions with psychological evaluation specialists and legal counsel to discuss your status and future assignments." Emily listened carefully, noting that the schedule was packed with back-to-back meetings that would give her no time to think, no opportunity to contact outside help, and no chance to reconsider her cooperation. It was the kind of agenda designed to overwhelm someone with official attention while maintaining complete control over their environment and communications. "Will I have any opportunity to contact family members or personal legal counsel?" Emily asked. "Of course," Davidson replied smoothly. We'll arrange supervised communications this evening after the formal briefings are complete. We just need to ensure that any conversations don't inadvertently compromise ongoing security assessments. Supervised communications. Emily filed that phrase away as confirmation that her fears about imprisonment disguised as protection were well-founded. She was being treated more like a security risk than a decorated soldier who'd simply defended herself against an unfair evaluation. The airfield at Fort Bragg buzzed with activity as their convoy approached. Emily could see soldiers and base personnel gathering at a respectful distance, obviously hoping to catch a glimpse of the woman who'd become an overnight sensation. Some held up phones trying to capture photos or video, despite the obvious presence of federal security personnel. The aircraft waiting for them was a military transport configured for VIP passengers with comfortable seating and communication equipment that suggested they'd be able to conduct business during the flight. Emily noted the additional security personnel already aboard, and the fact that all the windows had been covered to prevent anyone from seeing inside or outside during transport. As they boarded, Emily's phone buzzed with a text message from her Aunt Sarah. "Emily, I've been trying to reach you. There are people asking questions about our family. Be very careful who you trust. Some of Grandfather's old friends are worried about your safety." Emily quickly deleted the message before Davidson could see it, but the warning reinforced her growing certainty that the situation was far more complex and dangerous than anyone was admitting. If her grandfather's old friends were worried about her safety, it suggested that Murphy wasn't the only person who knew about the classified background and the threats it represented. The flight to Andrews Air Force Base took less than 2 hours, but it felt much longer as Davidson and his colleague peppered Emily with what they called preliminary questions about her training and background. The questions seemed designed to map out everything she knew about her grandfather's techniques while establishing exactly how much classified information she might possess unknowingly. "When your grandfather taught you these techniques, did he ever mention where he'd learned them?" Davidson asked, consulting notes on his tablet. He said they were family traditions that had been passed down for generations. "Did he ever reference specific instructors or training programs?" Emily chose her words carefully, remembering Murphy's warnings about cooperation versus surrender. "He mentioned training with various people during his military service, but he never provided specific details about programs or classifications." "What about documentation? Did he leave any written materials or training manuals?" "No, sir. Everything was taught through demonstration and practice. He always said the most important knowledge couldn't be written down because it had to be understood through experience." Emily could see Davidson making notes, probably marking areas where follow-up questions would be necessary. She was walking a careful line between providing enough information to maintain credibility while withholding details that might be used against her later. The Pentagon appeared through the aircraft's windows as they approached Andrews, its massive geometric shape dominating the Virginia landscape like a concrete monument to military power. Emily had been there twice before for briefings related to her sniper assignments, but today it felt more like approaching a fortress where she would be either protected or imprisoned. The transfer from Andrews to the Pentagon was handled with the same excessive security that had characterized the entire journey. More black SUVs, more agents, more procedures, designed to ensure that Emily remained completely isolated from any outside contact or assistance. She was beginning to understand that the federal response to her viral moment wasn't just about protecting classified information, it was about controlling the narrative and managing the political implications of her success. The Pentagon's corridors felt different today, charged with an energy that suggested her arrival had been anticipated and prepared for at the highest levels. Emily was escorted through security checkpoints and past offices where she could see personnel watching her passage with obvious curiosity. Word of her presence had clearly spread throughout the building. Their first stop was a conference room deep within the Defense Intelligence Agency section, where Emily found herself facing a panel of senior officers and civilian officials who looked like they'd been briefing national security issues since before she was born. The room's atmosphere was formal and intimidating, designed to make visitors understand that they were in the presence of people who made decisions that affected global security. General Patricia Morrison, no relation to the colonel whose career Emily had inadvertently destroyed, served as the panel's chairperson. She was a compact woman in her early 60s with steel gray hair and the kind of bearing that suggested she'd earned every star on her uniform through competence rather than politics. Staff Sergeant Vance General Morrison began, "We appreciate your cooperation in helping us understand the security implications of yesterday's events. I want to assure you that this briefing is designed to protect both national interests and your personal safety." Emily remained standing at attention until invited to sit, maintaining the military courtesy that felt increasingly important as she found herself surrounded by people whose motivations she couldn't fully trust. "Thank you, General. I'm prepared to answer your questions to the best of my ability." "Excellent. Let's begin with your grandfather's military service." According to classified records, Master Sergeant William Vance was involved in several programs that developed unconventional combat techniques. How much did he tell you about these programs? Emily repeated the same careful answers she'd given to Davidson during the flight, emphasizing that her grandfather had framed his teachings as family traditions rather than military programs. She could see the panel members exchanging glances that suggested they weren't entirely satisfied with her responses. Dr. Elizabeth Chen, a civilian analyst who introduced herself as a specialist in international martial arts intelligence, leaned forward with obvious interest. "Sergeant Vance, some of the techniques you demonstrated yesterday correspond to methods that our intelligence agencies have observed in foreign special operations units. Specifically, several moves appeared to be derived from Soviet Sistema training and Chinese military Sanda programs. How would your grandfather have gained access to those techniques?" The question revealed more than Emily had expected about the government's knowledge of international combat programs. "Ma'am, I wouldn't know how to identify the origins of specific techniques. My grandfather taught me what he called practical applications without discussing their historical or cultural backgrounds. But you must have noticed similarities when you encountered other martial arts or combat systems during your own military training." Emily considered her response carefully. She had indeed noticed that some of her grandfather's techniques seemed to incorporate elements from various martial arts traditions, but acknowledging that might open doors to questions she wasn't prepared to answer. "Ma'am, my military training focused primarily on marksmanship and field operations. I didn't have extensive exposure to hand-to-hand combat systems that would allow me to make those kinds of comparisons." General Morrison consulted her own notes, frowning slightly. "Sergeant Vance, I'm going to be direct with you. The techniques you demonstrated yesterday represent capabilities that could significantly affect military planning and international security assessments. If foreign governments believe that American soldiers possess these abilities as standard training, it could influence their own program development and strategic calculations." Emily felt the weight of implications she'd never considered. Her 83-second performance hadn't just been about personal vindication. It had potentially affected global military balance calculations and international intelligence assessments. "General, I understand the concerns, but I want to emphasize that these are not standard American military capabilities. They're personal skills that I inherited from my grandfather, not systematic training that other soldiers receive." "That distinction may not be apparent to foreign observers," Dr. Chen interjected. "When they see an American staff sergeant defeat five elite soldiers using advanced techniques, they're going to assume that represents broader American capabilities. They're going to want to understand how to counter those techniques and how to develop similar capabilities for their own forces." The briefing continued for nearly 3 hours, covering everything from Emily's training history to assessments of international reactions to the viral video. Emily found herself repeating the same careful answers while trying to gauge exactly how much the panel already knew about her grandfather's background and the circumstances surrounding his death. When they finally broke for lunch, Emily was escorted to a small dining room where she found herself alone with the Secretary of Defense, James Patterson. Patterson was a former Marine general who'd transitioned to civilian leadership, bringing with him a reputation for straight talk and practical decision-making that had earned respect across party lines. "Sergeant Vance," Patterson said, gesturing for her to sit across from him at a small table set for two. "I wanted to speak with you privately because I think there are aspects of this situation that aren't being fully addressed in the formal briefings." Emily waited, sensing that this conversation might be different from the morning's interrogation-style sessions. Patterson poured coffee for both of them, his movements deliberate and unhurried. "I've been briefed on your service record, your grandfather's background, and the circumstances that led to yesterday's evaluation. I've also been made aware of certain security concerns that some of my advisors believe require immediate action." "What kind of action, sir?" "The kind that would effectively end your military career and place you in indefinite protective custody while we assess the full scope of potential security compromises." Patterson met her eyes directly. "There are people in this building who believe that the knowledge you possess is too dangerous to exist outside direct government control." Emily felt her stomach tighten. Patterson was confirming her worst fears about the government's intentions, but his tone suggested that he might not agree with those assessments. "Sir, I've served my country with honor for 10 years. I've never compromised classified information or violated any security protocols. I don't understand why my inheritance of family knowledge should be treated as a criminal matter." Patterson nodded slowly. "Because some people in the intelligence community believe that your family knowledge represents capabilities that were developed using taxpayer funding and classified research. They argue that those techniques belong to the government regardless of how you acquired them." "And what do you believe, sir?" Patterson was quiet for a long moment, studying Emily's face as if trying to assess her character and trustworthiness. "I believe that we have a decorated soldier who defended herself against an unfair evaluation and is now being punished for proving that she's more capable than her critics expected. I also believe that treating loyal soldiers as security risks is a good way to create actual security problems." Emily felt a surge of hope mixed with continued wariness. Patterson seemed more reasonable than the morning's panel, but he was also in a position where political considerations might override his personal inclinations. "Sir, what are my options?" "Officially, you don't have many. The security assessment process can continue indefinitely, and protective custody can be extended for as long as deemed necessary. Unofficially, there might be alternatives if you're willing to consider them." Emily waited for him to continue. "There's a small unit within Special Operations Command that works on unconventional problems. They report directly to my office and operate with considerable autonomy in addressing security challenges that don't fit normal organizational structures. If you were assigned to that unit, your unique capabilities could be put to productive use while maintaining appropriate security oversight." Emily recognized the offer for what it was, a compromise that would give her more freedom than indefinite detention while ensuring that her abilities remained under government control. It was probably the best option she was going to receive, but it also meant accepting that her previous military career was effectively over. "What would that assignment involve, sir?" "Training other special operations personnel in selected techniques, consulting on international martial arts intelligence, possibly field assignments where your specific capabilities would be valuable." Patterson leaned forward slightly. "It wouldn't be the career you planned, but it would be meaningful service that makes use of your unique background." Emily thought about Murphy's warnings about her grandfather's murder and about the forces that were apparently willing to kill to prevent certain knowledge from spreading. Patterson's offer might be genuine, but it also might be a more sophisticated trap designed to achieve the same control through different means. "Sir, I appreciate the offer, but I need to understand something. Are there people in the government who might view my knowledge as something that should be eliminated rather than controlled?" Patterson's expression grew serious. "That's a very perceptive question, Sergeant. And the honest answer is yes, there are people who believe that certain capabilities are too dangerous to exist at all. They would prefer to see that knowledge disappear entirely rather than risk it being compromised or misused. Including the people who killed my grandfather." The words hung in the air between them like a challenge. Patterson's eyes narrowed slightly, and Emily realized that she'd just revealed knowledge that she wasn't supposed to possess. "Who told you about your grandfather's death?" Patterson asked quietly. Emily made a split-second decision to trust the one person in this building who'd shown her genuine respect. Someone who served under him and believes that I'm in danger from the same people who killed him. Patterson was quiet for several minutes, obviously weighing the implications of Emily's revelation. When he finally spoke, his voice carried a weight that suggested he was sharing information that could have serious consequences. "Sergeant Vance, there are elements within the intelligence community that have been operating with minimal oversight for decades. They've convinced themselves that protecting national security justifies almost any action, including eliminating American citizens who possess knowledge they consider dangerous. Your grandfather's death wasn't natural, and there are people who would be perfectly willing to arrange a similar fate for you." Emily felt validation and terror in equal measure. Patterson was confirming Murphy's warnings while also revealing that the threat came from within the American government itself. "Why are you telling me this, sir?" "Because I believe that loyal Americans deserve better from their government, and because I think you're going to need allies if you want to survive what's coming next." Patterson stood up and moved to the window, looking out at the Pentagon's central courtyard. "The unit I mentioned earlier, it's not just about putting your capabilities to productive use. It's about protecting people like you from people like them." Emily joined him at the window, trying to process the offer and its implications. "How do I know I can trust you?" "You don't, but you're running out of people who are willing to offer you alternatives to indefinite detention or worse." Patterson turned to face her directly. "What you decide in the next few hours is going to determine whether you spend the rest of your life as a government asset, a government prisoner, or a government target." The afternoon sessions proceeded according to the schedule Davidson had outlined, but Emily now understood them in a completely different context. The psychological evaluations were designed to assess her stability and compliance potential. The legal briefings focused on her obligations and the consequences of non-cooperation. The technical debriefings mapped out her capabilities with the thoroughness of people planning to either use or neutralize them. Through it all, Emily maintained the same careful balance of cooperation and reservation that had served her throughout the day. She provided enough information to demonstrate good faith while withholding details that might be used against her. But as the hours passed, she became increasingly aware that her time for making decisions was running out. During a brief break between sessions, Emily managed to slip away to a restroom where she could safely use Murphy's secure communication device. She sent a simple message, "In DC, options limited, advice needed." The response came within minutes. "Package prepared for extraction if necessary. Will monitor your location. Signal if immediate assistance required." Emily deleted the message exchange and returned to the briefing room, but knowing that Murphy was maintaining overwatch gave her the confidence to push back more firmly against some of the more invasive questions. She was no longer completely alone in a system that seemed designed to eliminate her autonomy. The final session of the day was with Agent Brooks and a team of lawyers who presented what they called a cooperation agreement that would formalize her assignment to Patterson's special unit while establishing security protocols that would govern her future activities. The document was dozens of pages long and filled with legal language that essentially signed away most of her constitutional rights in exchange for continued military service. This agreement ensures your protection while allowing you to serve your country in ways that make use of your unique capabilities, Brooks explained. It's really the best possible outcome given the security concerns that have been raised. Emily read through the document, carefully noting clauses that would give the government broad authority over her communications, travel relationships, and even living arrangements. It was a comprehensive framework for control that would make her a government asset rather than a free citizen. "I need time to consider this," Emily said, setting the document aside. "Unfortunately, time is a luxury we don't have," Brooks replied. "The Security Assessment Committee meets tomorrow morning to make final recommendations about your status. If you haven't agreed to formal cooperation by then, they're likely to recommend indefinite protective custody pending further evaluation." Emily understood the ultimatum perfectly: sign away her freedom voluntarily or have it taken away through official channels. But she also remembered Patterson's warning about elements within the intelligence community who preferred permanent solutions to security problems. "I'll give you my answer tomorrow morning," Emily said, standing up to signal the end of the session. That evening, Emily was escorted to quarters in a Pentagon guest facility that felt more like a comfortable prison than military housing. Her protective detail was augmented by additional personnel who maintained constant surveillance of the building's entrances and perimeter. She was allowed supervised telephone calls to family members, but the conversations were monitored and recorded for security purposes. She called her Aunt Sarah, keeping the conversation deliberately vague while trying to convey that she was safe but facing difficult decisions. Sarah seemed to understand the subtext, responding with careful references to family strength and the importance of honoring her grandfather's memory. After the official supervision ended for the evening, Emily used Murphy's device to send another message: "Agreement presented, signature required tomorrow, alternatives." Murphy's response was immediate and stark: "No good alternatives through official channels. Prepare for extraction at 0300 if willing. High risk, but maybe only option for maintaining autonomy." Emily stared at the message, understanding that Murphy was offering to help her escape from government custody. It would mean becoming a fugitive, abandoning her military career, and living as a target of the same forces that had killed her grandfather. But it might also be her only chance to maintain control over her own life and the knowledge she'd inherited. She spent hours weighing her options, pacing the small quarters, while trying to decide between Patterson's offer of controlled service and Murphy's promise of dangerous freedom. Both paths led away from the military career she'd planned, but one offered the possibility of retaining her principles, while the other guaranteed their compromise. At 0200, Emily made her decision. She gathered her few belongings, including Murphy's communication device, and prepared for whatever consequences awaited. The 83 seconds that had started this cascade of events had proven that she was capable of far more than anyone expected. Now she would discover whether those same capabilities could help her navigate the treacherous world of competing loyalties and hidden agendas that her grandfather had died trying to protect her from. The choice between cooperation and resistance would define not just her future, but potentially the fate of knowledge that others had died to preserve or destroy. As she waited for Murphy's signal, Emily understood that her real test was just beginning. Réessayer TS. Part 5. Louis Viet 9000 to Liên Kết Liên Mật với các phần trực. Trong câu chuyện phái hội thoại tạo thành một câu chuyện liền mạch khi ghép lại. Mỗi phần liền mạch với phần trước, không giới thiệu lại câu chuyện ở đầu phần mới. Liên kết các phần của câu chuyện một cách liền mạch. Sử dụng câu chuyện tiếp giữa các phần. Duy trì chủ đề, tránh ngắt quãng đột ngột, không sử dụng gạch đầu dòng hoặc tiêu đề phụ phong cách kể chuyện Mỹ-Hoa Kỳ giống văn giàu cảm xúc. Kể theo ngôi thứ ba, giữ đồ kịch tính không viết lần màn, kết thúc phần không giới thiệu phần sau. Lưu ý trả lời trong một tin nhắn không nháy sang mức document modifier. As the clock approached 300, Emily positioned herself near the window of her Pentagon quarters, watching the patterns of the security patrols that had been maintaining constant surveillance since her arrival. The guards moved with military precision, but their routes were predictable, a weakness that someone with her training could exploit if necessary. She'd already identified 3 potential exit routes and memorized the timing of the shift changes that occurred every 4 hours. Murphy's secure device vibrated once against her palm, the signal they'd agreed upon. Emily took a final look around the sterile government quarters that might have been her prison for months or years to come, then quietly opened the window and slipped into the humid Virginia night. The Pentagon's exterior grounds were a maze of security measures, surveillance cameras and patrol routes designed to prevent exactly what Emily was attempting. But her grandfather's training had included lessons about moving through hostile territory, and she applied those skills now as she made her way toward the predetermined extraction point near the building's north parking structure. She was halfway to the rendezvous when her path was blocked by a familiar figure stepping out of the shadows. Agent Davidson stood between Emily and her escape route, his weapon drawn, but pointed at the ground in a non-threatening position. "I thought you might try something like this," Davidson said quietly, his voice carrying disappointment rather than anger. "You're making a serious mistake, Sergeant Vance." Emily stopped moving but remained ready to react if Davidson made any aggressive moves. "Agent Davidson, I didn't expect to see you here. I've been monitoring the situation since our arrival. When we detected unauthorized communications from your quarters, it became clear that you had outside assistance." Davidson stepped closer, his expression earnest. "Emily, the people who are offering to help you, they're not your friends. They're using you to access information that could seriously damage American security interests." Emily felt doubt creeping into her resolve. Davidson seemed genuinely concerned for her welfare, and his warning about Murphy's motivations echoed her own lingering uncertainties about trusting someone she barely knew. "How do I know you're not the one who's lying?" Emily asked. "How do I know that this protective custody isn't just a more sophisticated form of elimination?" Davidson holstered his weapon and pulled out his own communication device. "Because I'm going to show you something that will change your perspective on everything that's happened." He activated the device and projected a holographic display that showed surveillance footage from multiple angles. Emily recognized the old training facility at Range 19, where she'd met with Murphy the previous night, but the timestamp showed activity from several hours after their meeting. "After you left last night, Murphy met with 3 other individuals," Davidson explained as the footage showed figures moving through the abandoned building. "2 of them are known operatives for Chinese military intelligence. The third is a former Russian Spetsnaz officer who's been selling American military secrets for the past decade." Emily felt her stomach drop as she watched Murphy hand over what appeared to be documents and photographs to the foreign operatives. The man who'd claimed to be protecting her grandfather's legacy was apparently selling that same information to America's adversaries. "This doesn't make sense," Emily said, though the evidence was undeniable. "He knew things about my grandfather that only someone from the program would know." Because he was from the program. Sergeant Murphy was a Ghost Walker participant who was discharged for psychological instability and suspected foreign contacts. Davidson manipulated the holographic display to show Murphy's service record, highlighting disciplinary actions and security concerns. He's been using his knowledge of the program to identify former participants and their families, then selling that information to foreign intelligence services. Emily realized that Murphy had manipulated her fears and uncertainties to gain access to information about her capabilities and training. Her grandfather's warnings about being careful who to trust applied as much to people claiming to be allies as to obvious enemies. "Why didn't you tell me this earlier?" Davidson deactivated the display and returned the device to his pocket. because we needed to confirm his intentions and identify his contacts. Your escape attempt was the perfect opportunity to document his network and gather evidence for prosecution. Emily felt manipulated by both sides, caught between competing narratives where everyone claimed to be protecting her while pursuing their own agendas. So what now? Do I go back to signing away my rights to serve in your special unit? Actually, the situation has changed significantly since this afternoon. Davidson checked his watch, noting that it was now past 3:30. The intelligence we gathered tonight about Murphy's activities has convinced the Secretary of Defense that your knowledge needs to be protected, not controlled. There's a new proposal that might interest you. Emily remained skeptical, but she was curious about what alternative Davidson might present. What kind of proposal? A consulting position that would allow you to maintain your military career while providing specialized training and assessment services. You'd work with special operations units on a project basis, keeping your knowledge active while ensuring it's used for American interests rather than foreign ones. The offer sounded more reasonable than the comprehensive control agreement she'd been presented with earlier, but Emily had learned to be suspicious of anything that seemed too good to be true. What's the catch? No catch, just conditions. You'd need to accept periodic security briefings and agree to report any attempts by foreign agents to make contact. You'd also need to provide detailed documentation of your training methods so we can develop countermeasures in case foreign services try to replicate your capabilities. Emily considered the proposal while watching for signs of Murphy or his extraction team. The consulting arrangement would give her more freedom than the previous offer, while still keeping her under some level of government oversight. But it also meant accepting that her inheritance of family knowledge had made her a permanent person of interest to intelligence agencies. How do I know this isn't just another form of control disguised as cooperation? Davidson's expression grew serious. Because you've already demonstrated that you can't be controlled against your will. Tonight proved that you have resources and capabilities that make traditional detention methods ineffective. The government's choice is to work with you as a partner or constantly guard against you as a threat. Partnership is more efficient and more respectful of your service record. Emily heard footsteps approaching from multiple directions, suggesting that her escape attempt had been detected by the larger security apparatus. Davidson noticed her reaction and raised his hands to show that he wasn't preparing for confrontation. "Those are my people," he said. "They're here to escort you back to quarters, not to arrest you. The decision about your future still depends on what you choose to do." In the next few minutes, Emily realized that Murphy's extraction plan had been compromised from the beginning, possibly because Davidson's people had been monitoring communications or because Murphy himself had been working with multiple parties. Either way, her attempt to escape government custody had failed before it really began. "What happened to my contact?" Emily asked, though she suspected she already knew the answer. "Murphy and his associates are in federal custody. The Chinese and Russian operatives were allowed to leave the country in exchange for intelligence about their broader networks." Davidson gestured toward the approaching security personnel. "Your escape attempt actually helped us roll up a significant espionage operation." Emily felt a mixture of relief and anger. Relief that she hadn't succeeded in trusting someone who was betraying American interests, but anger that she'd been used as bait in a counterintelligence operation without her knowledge or consent. "So I was never really in control of this situation at all." "You had more control than you realize," Davidson said as the security team reached their position. "Your decisions and actions tonight helped determine how this situation would be resolved. If you'd simply signed the cooperation agreement yesterday, we never would have identified Murphy's network or gathered evidence of foreign intelligence interest in your capabilities." The security personnel maintained a respectful distance while Davidson and Emily concluded their conversation, but their presence made it clear that her options were now limited to variations of cooperation with federal authorities. "Agent Davidson," Emily said, making her final decision. I'll accept the consulting arrangement under two conditions. First, I want all agreements and expectations in writing, with legal review by counsel of my choosing. Second, I want full disclosure about my grandfather's death and the circumstances that led to his murder. Davidson nodded slowly. The first condition is reasonable and can be arranged immediately. The second condition involves classified information that may require additional clearances and approvals, but I'll advocate for full disclosure given your obvious need to understand the threats you're facing. As they walked back toward the Pentagon building, Emily reflected on how dramatically her life had changed since the previous morning. The 83 seconds that had started, everything seemed like they'd happened to someone else, a simpler person who'd believed that competence and honor were sufficient to navigate military life. Now she understood that knowledge and capability came with responsibilities and dangers that extended far beyond individual achievement. Her grandfather's legacy wasn't just about combat techniques, it was about choosing how to use those techniques in a world where multiple parties wanted to control or eliminate them. The next few hours passed in a blur of paperwork, legal consultations, and security briefings that formally established Emily's new role as a special consultant to the Department of Defense. The arrangement gave her more autonomy than she'd expected, while requiring her to accept oversight responsibilities that would be part of her life for the foreseeable future. Dawn was breaking over the Virginia countryside when Emily finally had a moment to process what had happened and what lay ahead. She was no longer just Staff Sergeant Emily Vance, decorated sniper and combat veteran. She was now Emily Vance, guardian of classified knowledge and consultant on capabilities that others had died to protect or obtain. Agent Davidson found her in the Pentagon's main corridor as she prepared to return to Fort Bragg to collect her belongings and formally transition to her new assignment. "Sergeant Vance," he said, approaching with a manila folder that carried classification markings. "I have something for you." Emily accepted the folder and opened it to find copies of documents related to her grandfather's death investigation, including autopsy reports, surveillance files, and intelligence assessments that had never been made public. The truth that Murphy had promised to reveal was finally being provided through official channels. "This is everything we have about the circumstances surrounding Master Sergeant Vance's death," Davidson explained. "Some of it is disturbing, but you deserve to know the truth about what happened and why." Emily scanned the documents quickly, noting references to foreign agents, compromised officials, and a conspiracy that had cost her grandfather his life because he'd refused to provide information about Project Ghostwalker participants and their families. "He died protecting people like me," Emily said quietly. "He died protecting the idea that knowledge and capability should be used to defend America, not sold to the highest bidder." Davidson paused at the building's exit. "The people who killed him are still out there, and they're still interested in acquiring the techniques he taught you. Your consulting role isn't just about training American soldiers, it's about ensuring that your grandfather's sacrifice wasn't in vain." Emily stepped out into the morning sunlight, feeling the weight of responsibility settling on her shoulders like a familiar burden. The viral video that had started everything was already being forgotten by the social media cycles that moved on to new content every few hours. But the consequences of those 83 seconds would continue to shape her life and the lives of others for years to come. Her phone buzzed with a text message from Sergeant Collins at Fort Bragg. "Ma'am, when you get back, there's something you should know. Your performance yesterday has inspired a lot of female soldiers to request combat training. The chain of command is talking about developing new programs. You've started something bigger than anyone expected." Emily smiled for the first time since the evaluation had ended. Perhaps the most important legacy of her morning's work wouldn't be the classified techniques or the international attention or the government oversight. Perhaps it would be the young women who saw her example and decided that they too could exceed everyone's expectations. As she prepared to return to Fort Bragg and begin the next phase of her career, Emily thought about her grandfather's advice to always be ready for challenges she didn't know she'd face. The evaluation in Conference Room Delta had tested her combat skills, but the real test had been everything that came after learning to navigate a world where capability and loyalty were measured in ways that went far beyond any training manual. She'd survived Morrison's trap, Davidson's manipulation, Murphy's betrayal, and the federal government's attempts to control her through various forms of bureaucratic pressure. Most importantly, she'd maintained her principles and her sense of purpose through challenges that might have broken someone with less preparation or resolve. The drive back to Fort Bragg gave Emily time to read through the classified documents about her grandfather's death and to plan for the responsibilities that awaited her. She would spend the next few weeks transitioning from her role as a sniper to her new position as a special consultant, but she would also be working to honor her grandfather's memory by ensuring that the knowledge he'd preserved continued to serve American interests rather than foreign ones. Colonel Morrison had wanted to prove that Emily Vance didn't belong in uniform. Instead, he'd given her a platform to demonstrate that she belonged in places where only the most capable soldiers could serve. The evaluation that was supposed to end her career had instead launched her into a role where her unique background could make a difference in ways that most soldiers never had the opportunity to experience. As Fort Bragg appeared on the horizon, Emily understood that her story was far from over. The 83 seconds had been just the beginning of a journey that would test everything her grandfather had taught her about strength, honor, and the responsibility that comes with exceptional capabilities. Whatever challenges lay ahead, she would face them with the same determination that had carried her through the impossible evaluation and the complex aftermath that followed. The woman who returned to Fort Bragg was different from the one who'd left 24 hours earlier. She carried new knowledge about threats and opportunities, new responsibilities for protecting and preserving critical capabilities, and new understanding of how individual actions could affect national security and international perceptions. But she also carried the same principles and commitment to service that had defined her throughout her military career. Emily Vance had proven that she was more than anyone expected. Now she would have the chance to help others discover their own unexpected capabilities and to ensure that the legacy her grandfather had died protecting would continue to serve the country they both loved.